Welcome to Haunted Voice channel for a rainy night. Before we get started, just a quick reminder, there are minimal ads in this video. If you enjoy the content, please hit the like button and subscribe. It really helps me create more stories for you. Also, I'd love to know where you're from and what time you're watching. I hope you enjoy the stories, and thank you so much for tuning in. Now let's get started. I've been a truck driver for over 15 years, and I've seen a lot of strange things on the road. Long, lonely highways, late-night drives through foggy back roads, and odd encounters at run-down truck stops. But there's one trip that still haunts me, a haul that I wish I could forget but never will. They say the road has a way of swallowing up those who wander too far off the beaten path, and I found out the hard way that some places you just aren't meant to find. It was a few years ago, and I was running a late-night delivery from Dallas to Denver. It was a long haul, but nothing I hadn't done before. My route took me through a desolate stretch of highway that cut through the Texas Panhandle. It was the kind of road where you could drive for hours without seeing another soul, just endless flatlands, the occasional abandoned farmhouse, and miles of nothing. I'd been driving for about 6 hours when I saw the sign, "Detour ahead." I cursed under my breath. The GPS didn't show any detours, and there hadn't been any construction alerts when I'd checked earlier. But sure enough, as I rounded a bend, there were orange cones and a flashing sign directing all traffic to take a small exit. I had no choice, so I turned off the main road onto a narrow 2-lane route. The detour took me deep into the backcountry. The road was rough, with cracks and potholes, and it wound through thick, tangled woods that my headlights barely cut through. The further I drove, the more the road seemed to close in, the trees leaning over like they were trying to block out the sky. My radio cut to static, and my phone had no signal. I was completely alone. After about an hour, I realized something was wrong. The detour signs had disappeared, and the road seemed to twist and turn with no rhyme or reason. I kept thinking I'd see another sign or at least a marker telling me I was going in the right direction, but there was nothing. Just dark, overgrown trees and the sense that I was driving in circles. I checked the GPS again, but it showed me as a blinking dot in the middle of a green void. No roads, no towns, nothing. I pulled over, trying to get my bearings, but the woods were silent, oppressively so. No wind, no rustling leaves, just the low hum of my idling engine. I thought about turning around, retracing my path, but something told me that wouldn't work. I felt trapped, like the road itself didn't want to let me go. I kept driving, my eyes scanning for anything familiar, any sign of life. That's when I saw it, a small, flickering light up ahead. As I got closer, I realized it was an old gas station, the kind you'd expect to see in an old black and white movie. It looked abandoned, with a rusted sign swinging in the wind and a single flickering bulb hanging over the entrance. But I was low on gas and desperate for some direction, so I pulled in. I stepped out of the truck, the gravel crunching under my boots. The air was thick with the smell of gasoline and decay, and the silence was unnerving. I looked around, but there was no one in sight. The place was empty, like it hadn't seen a customer in years. I walked up to the door and peered inside. The windows were grimy, and the inside was dark, but I could make out the faint outline of shelves and an old dusty counter. I was about to turn back when the lights inside flickered on, buzzing with a dull, yellow glow. I jumped, my heart racing. But then I heard it, the faint sound of a radio playing somewhere inside. A crackling old tune that I couldn't quite place, but it felt out of time, like something from decades past. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The place was empty. Shelves lined with dusty cans, old newspapers stacked in a corner, and a counter with an ancient cash register that looked like it hadn't been used in years. The radio was perched on the counter, playing that same haunting tune. I called out, but my voice echoed in the empty room. There was no one there. I started to leave, but then I noticed something odd. A door at the back of the gas station, slightly ajar. I don't know why, but I felt drawn to it, like I needed to see what was behind it. I pushed it open and stepped through. The The room was small and dark, with a single light bulb hanging from the ceiling. And in the center was a table with a map laid out on it. It was old, the edges frayed, but it was a map of the area, and it showed roads that didn't exist anymore, places that had been lost to time. And there, marked in red, was a winding route that matched the road I'd been driving on. It didn't lead anywhere, just circled around and around, going nowhere. As I studied the map, I felt a chill run down my spine. Something about it didn't feel right, like it was showing me a place that wasn't meant to be found. I turned to leave, but the door slammed shut behind me. I yanked at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The light bulb flickered, and the radio in the other room began to play louder, the song distorting into a garbled mess of static and voices. Panic set in, and I pounded on the door, shouting for help. The room felt smaller, the walls closing in, and the air grew colder. I turned back to the map, and that's when I saw it. My truck, drawn in perfect detail, parked right outside the gas station, and there, standing next to it, was a figure. A shadowy shape with no features, just a dark outline that seemed to be watching. I threw myself against the door, desperate to get out. Finally, it gave way, and I stumbled back into the gas station. The lights flickered violently, and the radio blared, voices whispering incoherently. I bolted for the exit, nearly tripping over my own feet as I ran to the truck. I jumped in, started the engine, and floored it, gravel spraying as I tore out of the parking lot. The road seemed different as I sped away, the trees bending and twisting, the shadows stretching unnaturally. I drove faster, not caring about the bumps and cracks, just wanting to get away. The headlights cut through the darkness, but the road never seemed to end. It felt like I was driving through an endless tunnel, with no way out. And then suddenly I burst through the tree line, and the familiar highway was in front of me. I swerved, barely avoiding a ditch, and pulled over, my hands shaking on the wheel. I looked back, but the road was gone, just flat fields and empty space. I sat there for a long time, trying to make sense of what had happened, but the gas station and the twisting road were nowhere to be seen. When I finally made it to Denver, I tried to tell some of the other drivers about what I'd seen, but they just laughed it off or looked at me like I was crazy. I even tried to find the detour on the map, but it didn't exist. No record of it, no reports of construction, nothing. I've taken that route many times since, but I've never seen the detour signs again. I stick to the main roads now, avoiding the back routes and the lonely stretches of highway that seem to go on forever. But sometimes, late at night, when I'm driving through the empty dark, I catch a glimpse of a flickering light in the distance, and I remember the gas station, the map, and the feeling that I was somewhere I wasn't supposed to be. I keep driving, never looking back, because I know some roads aren't meant to be traveled. And once you find them, or they find you, they're always waiting, just off the beaten path, ready to lead you into the unknown. I've always been a nature enthusiast. Hiking, camping, exploring the wilderness, these were my ways of escaping the grind of daily life. So when my friend Luke suggested a weekend trip to Pinewood National Park, I jumped at the chance. It was supposed to be a simple trip, hike some trails, camp under the stars, maybe spot some wildlife. But Pinewood had a reputation, one that I didn't believe at the time. Locals whispered about people who went missing there, about trails that didn't lead where they should. But I thought it was just talk, just stories to keep tourists on the marked paths. I was wrong. We arrived on a Friday afternoon. The air was crisp, and the dense canopy of pine trees filtered the sunlight into dappled patterns on the forest floor. The park was quiet, almost unnaturally so. There were no sounds of birds or rustling animals, just the occasional creak of branches swaying in the wind. Luke and I set up camp near a small stream, tucked away from the main paths. We planned to explore some of the lesser-known trails, the ones marked on old faded maps that Luke had found online. The first day was uneventful. We hiked, took pictures, and marveled at the untouched beauty of the forest. As evening approached, we settled around the campfire, laughing and sharing stories. The air grew colder, and the shadows of the trees stretched long and dark around us. Luke pulled out one of the maps, pointing to a trail that cut deep into the heart of the park. A trail that wasn't on any official map. "Let's try this one tomorrow," he said, his eyes gleaming with excitement. "Hardly anyone's been on it. We might find something cool." I hesitated. "Are you sure it's safe? I mean, there's probably a reason it's not marked." Luke shrugged. "Come on, man, that's what makes it fun. It's an adventure." His enthusiasm was contagious, and against my better judgment, I agreed. We turned in for the night, the sounds of the crackling fire and the rustling leaves lulling me to sleep. But in the middle of the night I woke up. I don't know what stirred me, but something didn't feel right. I sat up, straining to hear beyond the soft whispers of the wind. Then I heard it. A low, distant hum, like the sound of many voices murmuring at once. I stepped out of the tent, my breath visible in the cold night air. The forest was still, yet the hum persisted, coming from somewhere deep in the woods. I shined my flashlight around, but there was nothing, just the trees standing silent and watchful. I shook my head, chalking it up to my half-asleep brain playing tricks on me, and went back to bed. The next morning, we set off early, following the old map deeper into the park. The trail was barely visible, overgrown with weeds and tangled roots. It was clear that no one had walked this path in a long time. The deeper we went, the thicker the forest became, the trees closing in around us. The air grew heavy, and an uneasy silence settled over the woods. Even the wind seemed to have stopped. After about an hour, we came across a clearing. At the center stood an old, decaying cabin, half swallowed by the forest. It was unexpected, not marked on any map, and looked like it had been abandoned for decades. The wood was rotting, and the roof sagged under the weight of creeping vines. Luke's eyes lit up at the sight, but I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. "Let's check it out," Luke said, already making his way toward the cabin. I hesitated, glancing around. The air felt wrong here, thick and stagnant, but Luke was already at the door, pushing it open with a loud creak. I followed reluctantly, shining my flashlight into the darkness. The inside was just as decrepit as the outside. The floor was littered with debris, and the walls were covered in strange markings, symbols and crude drawings that looked like they had been scratched in with something sharp. "What the hell is this?" I muttered, running my hand over the markings. They felt rough and old, like they had been there for years. Luke was exploring the other side of the cabin, poking through old, dusty furniture and fallen beams. "Hey, check this out," he called. I turned to see him standing by a small trapdoor in the floor. It was partially hidden under a rug, and the wood around it was splintered and worn, as if it had been pried open many times. "Luke, I don't think we should—" I started, but he was already opening the door, revealing a narrow, pitch-black staircase leading down into the earth. "Come on, man, just a quick look," Luke insisted, grabbing his flashlight and starting down the steps. I cursed under my breath, but followed him. The stairs creaked under our weight, and the air grew colder with each step. The hum I'd heard the night before returned, louder now, resonating through the walls. We reached the bottom, and the space opened up into a small, cramped room. The walls were covered in more of the strange symbols, but these were different, fresher, almost wet-looking, as if they'd been drawn recently. The room smelled damp and earthy, and the humming was louder than ever, vibrating in my chest. At the center of the room there was a large circular pit. It was filled with dark, still water that reflected the dim light from our flashlights. I felt a wave of unease wash over me, stronger than before. Something about the pit felt wrong, like it was pulling at me, urging me to come closer. Luke moved toward the edge, peering into the water. "What do you think this is?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I shook my head, stepping back. I didn't want to know. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, to get as far away from this place as possible. "We should go," I said, my voice trembling. But Luke didn't move. He was staring into the water, transfixed, as if he could see something I couldn't. "Luke," I repeated louder this time, but he didn't respond. His eyes were wide and his expression had gone slack. I grabbed his arm, pulling him away from the pit. but he resisted, his gaze locked on the water. "It's calling me," he muttered, his voice hollow and distant. "What are you talking about?" I yelled, shaking him, but Luke just pointed at the pit, his finger trembling. I glanced down, and for a brief moment I saw it too. A face, pale and distorted, staring up from the water. It wasn't Luke's reflection or mine, it was something else, something old and twisted. I yanked Luke back, dragging him toward the stairs. He struggled, but I didn't let go, practically shoving him up the steps. The humming grew louder, almost deafening, and the air around us felt heavy, pressing in from all sides. We stumbled out of the cabin, slamming the door behind us, and ran. We didn't stop until we reached our campsite, our breaths ragged and our hearts racing. We packed up in silence, neither of us daring to speak about what we had seen. I couldn't shake the image of that face in the water, the way it seemed to be watching, waiting. As we made our way back to the main trail, I glanced over at Luke. He was pale, his eyes wide and unfocused. "Are you okay?" I asked, but he just nodded, avoiding my gaze. We made it back to the car and drove out of Pinewood without a word. The entire drive home, Luke didn't speak. He just stared out the window, his face pale and drawn. When we finally got back to the city, he mumbled a quick goodbye and left. I tried calling him the next day, but he didn't answer. Days turned into weeks, and I didn't hear from him. I thought about going to his place, but something held me back. Fear, maybe, or the sense that whatever happened in that cabin wasn't done with us. Then one night I got a call from an unknown number. I answered, and there was silence on the other end. Faintly in the background, I could hear the humming, low, insistent, and unmistakable. Then a soft whisper, so faint I could barely make it out. "It's still calling." The line went dead. I haven't heard from Luke since. I still hike, but I avoid Pinewood National Park. I stick to well-marked trails, and I don't wander off the path. Sometimes, though, when I'm alone in the woods, I can feel it, the pull of that place, the weight of eyes watching from the shadows. And I wonder if Luke is still out there, somewhere in those lost trails, listening to the call of the pit, or if one day I'll hear it too. I had been searching for a new place for weeks, desperate to find something affordable in the city. Everything was either too expensive or too far from work. Just as I was about to give up, I stumbled upon an ad online. Room for rent in a historic building, cheap, utilities included. It seemed too good to be true, but I was desperate, so I made an appointment to see it. The building was old, a relic from a different time, with faded brick walls and tall windows that hadn't been cleaned in years. It had a certain charm, though, with its creaky wooden floors and ornate moldings. The landlord, an older man named Mr. Carr, was friendly enough, though a bit odd. He led me up a narrow staircase to the third floor, chatting about the building's history and its many unique features. The room for rent was at the end of a long, dimly lit hallway. It was small but cozy, with a single window that overlooked the street. The walls were bare, and the furniture was basic: a bed, a dresser, and a desk. It wasn't much, but it felt like a hidden gem in the middle of the city, and I could actually afford it. I signed the lease that day and moved in over the weekend. The first few days were uneventful. I settled in, unpacked my things, and adjusted to the quirks of the building. The pipes clanged loudly in the walls, and the lights in the hallway flickered constantly. But I didn't mind. It was a roof over my head, and I was grateful for that. It wasn't long before I started noticing the strange things. It began with the noises. At first I thought it was just the building settling, or maybe my neighbors moving around. But these noises were different. Late at night, I would hear faint footsteps in the hallway, slow and deliberate, like someone pacing back and forth. They always started near the staircase and ended right outside my door. I would hold my breath, listening, but no one ever knocked. I tried peeking through the peephole a few times, but the hallway was always empty. The footsteps never seemed to belong to anyone. I asked Mr. Carr about it, but he just shrugged it off, saying the building was old and prone to making all sorts of sounds. He assured me that no one else had reported anything strange. A week later, I started hearing whispers. They were quiet, almost imperceptible, like a distant conversation just out of earshot. I couldn't make out the words, but I could feel the weight of them, like they were meant for me. They seemed to come from the walls, from the ceiling, sometimes even from the floor. I would check the hallway, even knocking on my neighbors' doors, but everyone denied hearing anything unusual. The strangest thing, though, was the room at the end of the hall. There was a door directly across from mine that I had never seen anyone enter or leave. It was always closed, and there was no nameplate or number on it. I assumed it was just a storage closet or maybe an unused office. But every night, without fail, I would hear the footsteps stop right in front of that door, and the whispers would grow louder, almost frantic. One night, after another bout of restless sleep, I decided to check it out. I grabbed my phone for light and stepped into the hallway. The air felt colder than usual, and my footsteps echoed off the walls. I walked to the end of the hall, stopping in front of the door. It looked like any other door in the building, old with peeling paint and a tarnished brass knob. I hesitated, a knot forming in my stomach. I didn't know what I expected to find, but I felt compelled to open it, like something on the other side was calling me. I reached out, gripping the doorknob, and slowly turned it. To my surprise, it wasn't locked. The door swung open with a soft creak, revealing a dark, empty room. I stepped inside, my phone's flashlight barely piercing the darkness. The room was small, even smaller than mine, with no windows and bare walls. There was nothing in it. No furniture, no decorations, just 4 walls and a floor. But as I looked closer, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. The walls were covered in scratches, deep gouges that crisscrossed the plaster in erratic patterns. Some were faint, like they had been made long ago, but others were fresh, the plaster still crumbling at the edges. I shined my light around, trying to make sense of the marks when I heard it. The whispers. Louder now, more distinct, like they were all around me. I turned, scanning the room, but there was no one there. The air felt heavy, pressing down on me, and I could feel the walls closing in. I backed out of the room, slamming the door shut, my heart racing. I stood there in the hallway, breathing heavily, the whispers still echoing in my ears. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had disturbed something that had been waiting in that room. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, that the scratches were from some animal or a previous tenant. But deep down, I knew there was more to it. The next day, I went to Mr. Carr's office, determined to get some answers. I told him about the room, about the noises and the scratches. He listened patiently, but his expression remained neutral, almost disinterested. When I finished, he simply said, "There is no room at the end of the hall." I blinked, stunned. "What do you mean? I was just in there last night." He shook his head. "That door leads to a maintenance closet. It's always been locked. No one's been in there for years." I argued with him, insisting that I had seen the room with my own eyes, but he wouldn't budge. He pulled out a set of keys and led me back up to the 3rd floor. We walked to the end of the hall, and he stopped in front of the door. My heart pounded as he unlocked it and swung it open. It was just a closet, a small, dusty space filled with old cleaning supplies and a broken mop. There were no scratches on the walls, no signs of the dark, empty room I had seen. I felt my stomach drop, my mind struggling to make sense of it. Mr. Carr gave me a concerned look, and I couldn't tell if he thought I was crazy or just playing some kind of prank. I didn't argue any further. I thanked him and went back to my room, my head spinning. That night, the footsteps returned, louder than ever. They stopped outside my door, and I could feel the presence on the other side waiting. I didn't dare open it. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my heart racing as the whispers filled the room. The next morning, I packed my bags and left. I didn't tell Mr. Carr, and I didn't care about breaking the lease. I just needed to get out. As I drove away, I glanced back at the building one last time. From my rearview mirror, I could see the windows of the third floor dark and empty, but as I turned the corner, I caught a glimpse of something, or someone, standing in the window at the end of the hall, watching me leave. I found a new place across town, a small studio apartment with no history, no quirks, and no strange noises in the night. But I still think about that room, the scratches on the walls, and the whispers that seem to follow me. Sometimes, late at night, I wake up to the sound of footsteps in the hallway, faint and distant, as if they followed me here. And I wonder if, wherever I go, that room at the end of the hall will always be waiting for me to open the door. I've always loved camping. There's something freeing about leaving behind the noise of the city, setting up a tent under the stars, and losing yourself in the tranquility of nature. So when my friend suggested a weekend camping trip deep in the national forest, I was all in. It was supposed to be a fun, relaxing getaway, just us, the trees, and the open sky. But what we found out there still haunts me to this day. We were a group of 5, me, my girlfriend Emily, her brother Jake, and our friends Sam and Laura. We picked a spot miles away from any marked trails, a secluded clearing surrounded by towering pines. It was perfect, quiet, remote, and far from the usual crowded campsites. We spent the first day setting up camp, hiking, and enjoying the solitude. As night fell, we gathered around the fire, laughing and sharing stories, the flames casting flickering shadows on the trees. The forest was peaceful at first. We could hear the usual sounds, the rustle of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl, the crackle of our fire. But as the night wore on, the atmosphere shifted. The forest grew unnaturally quiet, the kind of silence that makes you feel like you've gone deaf. The air felt heavier, almost electric, like the calm before a storm. We brushed it off, figuring the quiet was just nature settling in for the night. Around midnight, Jake wandered off to use the bathroom. He joked about not wanting to be eaten by a bear, and we all laughed, not thinking much of it. But after 20 minutes, he still hadn't come back. We called out for him, our voices echoing through the trees, but there was no answer. Just that same oppressive silence. Emily started to get worried, so Sam and I grabbed our flashlights and headed in the direction Jake had gone. We called his name, scanning the woods with our beams, but all we saw were trees and shadows. Just as we were about to head back to camp, we heard it, a faint, distant whisper like someone calling out from far away. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Sam nodded, looking just as uneasy. The sound was faint, almost like Jake's voice, but distorted, stretched out like a bad recording. We followed the sound deeper into the woods, our flashlights cutting through the thick darkness. The whispers grew louder, more distinct, but still incomprehensible, like a language just beyond understanding. We finally spotted Jake, standing in the middle of a small clearing, facing away from us. His posture was stiff, his head slightly tilted as if listening to something. I felt a chill run down my spine. There was something off about the way he stood, too still, too rigid. I called his name, but he didn't respond. He just stood there, unmoving. "Jake?" Sam called out, stepping closer. But as soon as we approached, Jake turned around, and I felt my stomach drop. His eyes were wide, unblinking, and his mouth hung open as if caught mid-scream. But no sound came out. His face was pale, almost lifeless, and his expression was blank, like he was in a trance. "Jake, are you okay?" I asked, reaching out to touch his shoulder. As soon as I made contact, he snapped out of it, blinking rapidly and gasping as if he'd been holding his breath. He looked at us, confused, and then around the clearing as if he didn't recognize where he was. I thought I heard someone calling me," he said, his voice shaky. "But when I got here, it just stopped." We hurried back to camp, not wanting to spend another minute in that clearing. Jake couldn't explain what had happened, and we tried to brush it off as just one of those weird things that happen in the woods. But the unease lingered, and none of us felt like sitting by the fire anymore. We turned in early, hoping that morning would bring some clarity. But sleep didn't come easy. The whispers returned just outside the thin walls of the tent, faint, insistent, like a chorus of voices speaking all at once. I tried to ignore them, telling myself it was just the wind or my imagination. But the whispers grew louder, more urgent, as if trying to draw me out into the darkness. I glanced over at Emily, who was lying next to me, her eyes wide open. "Do you hear that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. I nodded, my heart racing. We lay there, listening, too scared to move, as the whispers seemed to circle our tent, brushing against the fabric like fingers trailing along the walls. Suddenly, the tent zipper began to move slowly, deliberately, as if someone was unzipping it from the outside. Emily grabbed my arm, and I fumbled for the flashlight, shining it towards the entrance. The zipper stopped, and the whispers fell silent. I unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside, but there was nothing there, just darkness and the faint rustling of the trees. We didn't sleep at all that night. The whispers came and went, fading in and out like a distant radio signal. By dawn, we were all exhausted, huddled around the smoldering remains of the fire. Jake looked the worst, pale and shaken, his eyes darting around as if expecting something to jump out from the trees. "We need to leave," he said, his voice hoarse. "There's something wrong with this place." No one argued. We packed up in record time, eager to put as much distance between us and the clearing as possible. As we hiked back, the forest felt different, the trees more oppressive, their branches reaching out like twisted skeletal hands. The whispers followed us, growing fainter but never fully disappearing, like a low hum just beneath the surface of hearing. We made it back to the car and didn't stop driving until we reached the nearest town. We tried to talk about what happened, but none of us could find the words. We all heard the whispers. We all saw Jake standing there, and we all felt the cold, unnatural silence that hung over the valley. But none of it made any sense. A few weeks later, Jake called me late at night. He sounded off, more anxious than usual. "I've been dreaming about that place," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I keep seeing that clearing, but it's not empty. There's something there, watching." I tried to reassure him, but truth be told, I'd been having the same dreams. The clearing, the trees, the whispers. It was like the forest hadn't let go of us, like it had left a mark that wouldn't fade. I hung up, promising we'd get together soon, but deep down I knew we were all just trying to move on in our own way. A few days later, Emily found an article online about the area where we'd camped. It mentioned a group of settlers who'd vanished in that part of the forest back in the 1800s. The locals had a name for it, the Whispering Woods. They said it was cursed, that the voices of the lost still echoed through the trees, luring travelers into the darkness. I closed the article, a shiver running down my spine. We haven't been camping since, and every now and then, I think I hear it, the faint, distant whisper just on the edge of hearing, calling me back to the forest. I've learned to ignore it, to drown it out with the noise of everyday life. But I know it's still there, waiting, watching, and whispering. And if you ever find yourself deep in the woods, alone and surrounded by silence, listen closely. You might hear it too. The faint, insistent call of the Whispering Woods, pulling you deeper, away from the safety of the firelight, into the cold, unending dark. I've been a long-haul truck driver for over 20 years, and I've seen some strange things out there on the road. You get used to the long nights, the isolation, and the odd characters you meet at truck stops. But nothing prepared me for what happened on Route 89, a stretch of highway that cuts through the desolate backcountry, with nothing but empty road and endless darkness. They call it Dead Man's Stretch, and now I know why. It was a routine job, a late-night haul from Denver to Salt Lake City, just me and my rig loaded with freight. The dispatcher had warned me about the fog rolling in, but I'd driven in worse. As long as I kept my eyes on the road and my hands on the wheel, I'd be fine, or so I thought. I hit Road 89 around midnight. The fog was thick, wrapping around my truck like a heavy blanket. My headlights barely cut through it, casting an eerie glow on the road ahead. I turned on the radio, but all I got was static. Great, just me and the silence. I focused on the yellow lines, trying to keep my mind sharp. But the fog wasn't normal. It was dense, suffocating, and it seemed to cling to my windshield no matter how fast I went. After a couple of hours, the highway became even more desolate. No cars, no signs of life, just the empty road stretching into the dark. I'd been driving for hours without seeing a single soul, and that's when I noticed it. The faint outline of a figure standing on the shoulder, barely visible through the fog. I slowed down, squinting to make out the shape. It was a man, or at least it looked like one. He was tall, dressed in what seemed like an old-fashioned suit, the kind you'd see in black and white movies. He was just standing there, staring at my truck with a blank expression. I figured he must have been some stranded motorist, though I hadn't seen any broken-down cars. As I passed him, I felt a shiver run down my spine. His eyes were wrong, dark and empty, like bottomless pits. I sped up, leaving him behind in the fog, but the image stuck with me. I kept glancing in my mirrors, half expecting to see him following, but he was gone. Just the fog and the road. I told myself I was just tired, that I was seeing things, but the unease lingered. I pushed on, hoping to reach the next truck stop, but as I rounded a bend, my headlights caught another figure on the side of the road. It was him again, the same man, the same empty stare. He hadn't moved an inch, still standing there like he was waiting for something. My grip tightened on the wheel and I kept driving, refusing to slow down. I knew it was impossible for him to be there. I'd left him miles back, but there he was, clear as day. I passed him again, this time faster, my truck roaring as I pushed the pedal to the floor. The fog swallowed him up, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still there, somewhere in the dark, watching me. Minutes passed, maybe hours. I couldn't tell anymore. The fog was disorienting, and the miles blurred together. I kept my eyes on the road, too scared to look at the mirrors. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. I needed to pull over, get my bearings, but the road stretched on with no signs of civilization. Then in the distance I saw it, a dim light cutting through the fog. Relief washed over me as I realized it was a rest area, a small oasis of flickering neon in the endless dark. I pulled in, parking my rig and cutting the engine. The silence was immediate, pressing in on me as I stepped out of the cab. The fog swirled around my feet, thick and cold. The rest area was deserted. No other trucks, no cars, just the dim light of a vending machine humming softly. I rubbed my eyes, trying to shake off the fatigue, but the air felt heavy, like I was breathing underwater. I glanced around, half expecting to see the man in the suit lurking in the shadows, but the lot was empty. I headed to the vending machine, my footsteps echoing in the stillness. I bought a coffee, the warm cup a welcome comfort against the chill. As I turned to head back to my truck, I froze. There, in the reflection of the vending machine glass, was the man. He was standing behind me, close enough that I should have felt his breath on my neck. But there was nothing. No sound, no warmth, just the cold, suffocating fog. I spun around, but the lot was empty. My heart raced as I backed up, nearly tripping over my own feet. I scanned the area, my breath coming in short, panicked bursts. He was gone, but I knew he was out there. I could feel it. I bolted back to my truck, slamming the door shut and locking it. My hands shook as I fumbled with the keys, starting the engine and throwing the truck into gear. I didn't care where I was headed, as long as it was away from that place. The fog seemed to thicken as I pulled out, my headlights barely illuminating the road. I glanced at the passenger seat, and that's when I saw it. A small, crumpled piece of paper. I hadn't noticed it before. I picked it up, my fingers trembling as I unfolded it. It was an old, weathered photograph of a man standing beside a truck much like mine. He was wearing the same old-fashioned suit, his eyes dark and hollow. My blood ran cold as I realized the truck in the photo wasn't just similar to mine. It was the same make, the same color, even the same license plate. But the truck looked new, pristine, like it had just rolled off the line. The date scribbled on the back of the photo read 1956. My mind reeled. There was no way. My rig was only a few years old. But the man was unmistakably the same. I threw the photo down, my pulse racing as I tried to focus on the road. But every shadow, every flicker of light seemed to take his shape. I kept driving, refusing to stop, refusing to look back. Hours later, I finally reached a busy truck stop. The bustle of other drivers and the bright lights a welcome change from the suffocating darkness of the fog. I parked, my hands still shaking, and made my way inside, desperate for the presence of other people. I didn't care how crazy I looked. I just needed to feel normal again. I sat down at the counter, ordering a coffee, and tried to steady my nerves. The waitress, an older woman with a kind smile, handed me the cup. "You look like you've seen a ghost," she said, half joking. I forced a laugh, but it came out strained. As I sipped my coffee, I overheard a conversation between two older truckers at the next table. They were talking about Dead Man's Stretch, about the legends of the fog and the lost souls who wandered that highway. One of them mentioned a trucker from the 1950s who had gone missing along that route. His truck found abandoned in the fog. They said he was doomed to wander the road forever, searching for a way home. I glanced at them, my heart sinking. They saw me listening and nodded knowingly. "You look like you've been on Route 89, one of them said. "Seen him, haven't you? The man in the suit." I nodded slowly, the coffee cup trembling in my hand. They just nodded back, like it was the most normal thing in the world. "Best to keep moving," the other trucker said. "Don't let him hitch a ride." I never told anyone else what happened that night. I stuck to busier highways, avoided night hauls, and never set foot on Route 89 again. But every now and then, on a quiet stretch of road, I catch a glimpse in my rearview mirror, a flicker of movement, a dark figure standing just beyond the edge of the fog. I keep driving, my eyes fixed ahead, my grip tight on the wheel. Because I know if I stop, if I let him catch up, I might never make it home. I've always been an outdoorsy person, hiking, camping, getting lost in the wilderness. It's my escape from the grind of everyday life. There's something calming about being surrounded by nothing but trees, mountains, and the occasional chirp of a bird. But after what happened in the Silent Valley, I can't look at the wilderness the same way. It's been years, and I still can't shake the feeling that something out there is watching, waiting. It started as a routine trip to a national park in the Pacific Northwest. My friends and I planned a weekend of hiking through the remote trails, a place that boasted some of the most beautiful, untouched scenery in the country. The area was known for its dense forests, winding rivers, and stunning views. But there was one part of the park that the rangers advised against visiting, the Silent Valley. No official trails led there, and the name alone was enough to keep most people away. Locals had their stories, of course. They said the valley was cursed, that people who wandered in were never quite the same when they came out, if they came out at all. Some spoke of strange noises, whispers carried on the wind, or glimpses of shadowy figures just out of sight. But my friends and I were thrill seekers, always looking for the next adventure, and we weren't about to let a few ghost stories scare us off. We were young, reckless, and thought we were invincible. There were 4 of us, me, my best friend Sarah, her boyfriend Tom, and Tom's buddy Mike. We started early, the sun barely cresting the horizon, and made our way through the marked trails. The deeper we went, the more the landscape seemed to change. The trees grew taller, their branches intertwining overhead, casting long shadows that made it feel like twilight even in the middle of the day. We followed an old, barely visible path that Tom had found on a hiking forum. According to the post, it would lead us straight to the edge of the Silent Valley. We were excited, joking and laughing, not paying much attention to the way the forest seemed to grow quieter the further we went. By the time we reached the valley, the usual sounds of the forest, birds, insects, the rustling of leaves, had faded completely. It was unnervingly silent, as if the world had been put on mute. We stood at the edge, looking down into the valley below. It was beautiful, no doubt, an untouched expanse of trees and rocks, with a small river winding through it. But there was something off about it, a stillness that didn't feel right. Sarah voiced what we were all thinking. "It's way too quiet." We shrugged it off, attributing it to the elevation or some weird atmospheric thing. We were there for the adventure after all, and we weren't about to turn back now. We descended into the valley, making our way along the rocky terrain. The deeper we went, the thicker the air seemed to get, heavy and suffocating. It wasn't just the lack of sound. It was the feeling that we were being watched. Mike was the first to notice something wasn't right. He kept glancing over his shoulder, muttering about shadows that didn't make sense or movements in the corner of his eye. We laughed it off, teasing him about being scared of his own shadow, but as the day wore on, the tension grew. The sun was setting when we realized we were lost. The map Tom had printed was useless. The landmarks didn't match up, and the terrain seemed to change the further we walked. We decided to set up camp for the night, figuring we'd find our bearings in the morning. As we unpacked, Sarah froze, her eyes fixed on something in the distance. "What's that?" she whispered, pointing to a figure standing among the trees. It was too far away to make out clearly, just a dark silhouette against the fading light. Tom waved, laughing nervously, but the figure didn't move. It just stood there watching us. We all stared, waiting for it to do something. Wave back, turn around, anything. But it didn't. It just stayed there, perfectly still. The figure was gone by the time we finished setting up camp, but the unease lingered. We tried to make light of it, joking that it was just a fellow hiker who was as lost as we were. But as night fell, the silence grew heavier, oppressive. Our campfire, usually a source of comfort, seemed to barely cut through the darkness. Every now and then we'd hear rustling in the distance, soft footsteps that stopped as soon as we tried to pinpoint their source. Mike was on edge, his eyes darting around the perimeter of our camp. "I swear I keep seeing someone," he said, his voice low. "It's like they're circling us." We tried to calm him down, but truth be told, we all felt it, the sense of being stalked. The night dragged on, sleepless and tense. The forest, so full of life during the day, felt dead and unwelcoming under the cover of darkness. Around 3 a.m., I heard it, a faint whisper just outside the light of the campfire. It was soft, almost melodic, like someone singing a lullaby. I strained my ears trying to catch the words, but they were just out of reach, indistinct. I glanced at the others. They were all awake, eyes wide, listening. Tom stood up, flashlight in hand. "I'm going to check it out," he said, more to himself than to us. Before we could stop him, he walked towards the sound, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the trees. We watched as he disappeared into the darkness, his light bobbing up and down until it was swallowed by the night. Minutes passed, and then hours. Tom didn't come back. We called out for him, but our voices felt muffled, swallowed by the silence. Sarah was in tears and Mike was pacing, muttering about how this was a bad idea, how we should have listened to the rangers. We argued about whether to go after Tom or wait until morning, but deep down, none of us wanted to venture into the dark. The figure, the whispers, it was too much. We were scared, more scared than I'd ever been in my life. Just before dawn, we heard footsteps again, slow and deliberate, approaching our camp. We grabbed whatever we could find to defend ourselves, sticks, rocks, anything. But when the figure stepped into the dim light of the fire, we realized it wasn't Tom. It wasn't even human. The figure was tall and impossibly thin, with elongated limbs that bent at unnatural angles. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and its eyes were empty sockets, dark and void. It moved with a jerky, unnatural gait, like a puppet on strings. It didn't speak, but the whispering grew louder, filling our heads with a dissonant hum that made it hard to think. We backed away, huddling together as the figure loomed over us. It reached out, its fingers long and sharp, and for a moment, I thought it was going to grab one of us. But then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it stopped. It tilted its head as if listening to something we couldn't hear, then turned and disappeared into the forest, melting into the shadows. At first light, we packed up and ran, not caring about the path, just wanting to get out. We stumbled through the forest, our breaths ragged, the trees closing in around us. After what felt like hours, we finally broke through the tree line and found ourselves back on a marked trail. We flagged down a ranger, barely able to get the words out as we explained what had happened. They organized a search for Tom, but after days of looking, they found nothing. No signs of struggle, no footprints, just an empty valley and the lingering sense that something was terribly wrong. We left the park that day, shaken and silent. None of us spoke about what we'd seen, not really. The official report said Tom got lost, that he must have wandered off in the dark, but we knew better. Whatever was in the Silent Valley wasn't human, and it had taken Tom. Months later, I received a package in the mail with no return address. Inside was a photograph, a faded, grainy picture of the Silent Valley. Standing at the edge of the trees, just barely visible, was Tom. His expression was blank, his eyes hollow, and beside him was the tall, thin figure, its dark sockets staring directly at the camera. I tried to show it to Sarah and Mike, but when I went back to find the photo, it was gone. Just a blank piece of paper where the image had been. Sarah moved away. Mike stopped hiking altogether. And as for me, I haven't set foot in the woods since. I still think about that valley, about what we saw and what took Tom. I don't know if it was a spirit, a creature, or something else entirely. But I do know one thing. The Silent Valley isn't silent because of its stillness. It's silent because it's listening, and it's always waiting for someone new to wander in. I travel a lot for work. The endless parade of airports, rental cars, and hotel rooms has become a blur over the years, blending together into one long, monotonous journey. I've stayed in every kind of hotel you can imagine, from luxurious suites to dingy motels that reek of stale cigarettes. But there's one hotel I'll never forget, the Blue Ridge Inn. It was late fall, and I was on my way to a conference in a small town I'd never heard of. My flight had been delayed, and by the time I landed, it was already dark. I was exhausted, and all I wanted was a hot shower and a decent night's sleep. I booked a room at the Blue Ridge Inn because it was close to the airport and had decent reviews online. From the outside, the hotel looked like any other mid-range place. A standard brick building with a glowing sign out front, and a lobby that smelled faintly of lemon cleaner. The clerk at the front desk was a tired-looking woman who barely glanced up from her computer as she checked me in. She slid the key card across the counter, muttering something about breakfast hours. "Room 616, she said, her voice flat. "Elevators down the hall." I took the key and made my way to the elevator, my suitcase wheels clicking on the tile floor. The ride up was slow, the elevator creaking and groaning like it hadn't been serviced in years. When I stepped out onto the 6th floor, I noticed the hallway was dimly lit, the carpet worn and faded. It had that stale, musty smell that old buildings tend to accumulate. I found my room at the end of the hall, the door slightly ajar. I hesitated for a moment, wondering if housekeeping had forgotten to close it, but then pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was standard, 2 beds, a small desk, a TV mounted on the wall. Nothing unusual. But as I set my bag down, I felt a strange chill in the air, like the room was colder than it should have been. I glanced around, half expecting to see the window open, but everything was shut tight. I shrugged it off, blaming it on my tired mind, and went to take a shower. The hot water helped, and for a moment, I forgot about the cold and the lingering unease. But when I stepped out of the bathroom, I noticed something odd. One of the bedspreads was pulled back, the sheets rumpled as if someone had been lying there. I frowned, trying to remember if I'd touched it when I came in. I was sure I hadn't. I walked over and smoothed the sheets, a little unnerved but too tired to care. I decided to get some rest and worry about it in the morning. As I lay in bed, the room felt colder than ever. I pulled the blankets up to my chin, but it didn't help. The chill seemed to seep into my bones, a cold that no amount of blankets could chase away. I tossed and turned, unable to get comfortable, my eyes constantly drifting to the other bed, half expecting to see something. That's when I heard it, a faint rhythmic tapping coming from the wall behind the bed. It was soft at first, barely noticeable, but it grew louder, more insistent, like someone was tapping their fingernails against the plaster. I sat up, my heart pounding, straining to hear. It wasn't coming from the room next door, it was right behind the headboard. I banged on the wall, hoping to scare off whatever was making the noise, but the tapping continued, undeterred. Frustrated, I got up and turned on all the lights, hoping to shake off the creeping dread that was starting to take hold. I checked the closet, the bathroom, under the beds. Nothing. I even pressed my ear to the wall, trying to pinpoint the source of the noise, but it stopped the moment I got close. I crawled back into bed, leaving the lights on this time. I tried to convince myself it was just the pipes, the old building settling, but sleep didn't come easy. I kept my eyes on the clock, watching the minutes tick by, the tapping starting and stopping at random intervals. Sometime around 3 a.m., I finally drifted off, my exhaustion outweighing my fear. But my sleep was restless, filled with strange, disjointed dreams of long hallways and doors that wouldn't open. I woke up to the sound of my phone buzzing. It was the alarm, telling me it was time to get up and get ready for the conference. I rubbed my eyes and sat up, the events of the night before already fading into a hazy memory. That's when I noticed the second bed. It was in worse shape than before. The sheets tangled, the pillows tossed aside, like someone had thrashed around in their sleep. I stared at it, my pulse quickening. I was sure I hadn't touched it. I hadn't even slept in it. I got up, trying to make sense of it, but the room felt colder than ever, the air heavy and still. I grabbed my things and headed for the door, eager to get out of that room. But as I reached for the handle, I saw something that stopped me cold. Written on the mirror, in the foggy residue from my shower, were the words, "Get out." I stumbled back, my heart racing, and fumbled for the doorknob. I yanked the door open and rushed down the hall, not stopping until I reached the lobby. The clerk looked up, surprised to see me so early. "Is everything okay?" she asked, her tone flat but her eyes curious. I hesitated, unsure of what to say. I didn't want to sound crazy, but I couldn't just leave without saying anything. "There's something wrong with my room," I finally blurted out. "I think someone was in there, or—" I trailed off, unsure of how to explain the cold, the tapping, the writing on the mirror. The clerk's expression shifted, her eyes narrowing as she seemed to weigh her response. "Which room were you in?" she asked, her voice suddenly tense. "Room 616, I said. The clerk's face paled. She glanced at her computer screen, typing something in before shaking her head slowly. "That's not possible," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "We haven't rented out room 616 in months, not since—" She trailed off, her eyes darting nervously to the manager's office. "Not since what?" I demanded, the dread creeping back into my gut. She hesitated before finally speaking. "A guest. He died in there, in the bed. They found him one morning, just gone. No signs of struggle, no cause of death. It was like he just stopped." My mouth went dry. I thought of the cold, the tapping, the rumpled sheets on the other bed, the way the room felt so wrong, like I was never alone. I backed away from the desk, my mind reeling. "I need to leave," I said, my voice shaking. "I'm checking out." The clerk nodded, barely meeting my eyes. She didn't charge me for the night. She didn't even try to stop me. I grabbed my bag and bolted out of the hotel, not stopping until I was safely in my car with the doors locked. I drove away, putting as much distance as I could between me and the Blue Ridge Inn. I didn't go to the conference. I didn't even bother to call and cancel. I just kept driving. The memory of that room and the words on the mirror burned into my mind. A few days later, out of morbid curiosity, I searched for news about the hotel. There was nothing recent, just an old article from years ago about the man who had died in room 616. It didn't give any details, just mentioned that his death was unexplained and the room had been closed ever since. But there was a comment at the bottom from someone who claimed to have stayed there before the incident. They wrote about the cold, the tapping, the feeling of being watched. The last line sent a chill down my spine. Whatever's in that room doesn't want to be alone. I don't know what I experienced in room 616, but I know I'll never go back. And now, every time I check into a hotel, I make sure to ask which room I'm getting. Because there are some places, some rooms, that are best left empty. I've always been fascinated by unsolved mysteries, especially when it comes to missing persons. There's something deeply unsettling yet captivating about people who vanish without a trace, leaving behind only questions. So when I heard about a string of disappearances near Black Hollow Forest, I couldn't resist the urge to check it out for myself. Black Hollow was notorious in the area, a dense, sprawling forest with a network of hiking trails that were easy to get lost in. It was the kind of place that locals warned you about, a forest full of dark legends and eerie tales passed down through generations. People said it was haunted, cursed, or maybe something even worse. But for me, it was just another challenge, another piece of the world's unsolved puzzles. I drove out on a gray, overcast day, hoping the weather would keep most hikers away. The fewer people on the trails, the better. I wanted to experience the place in its raw, undisturbed state. I parked at the edge of the forest and started down the main trail, my backpack filled with essentials and my phone fully charged with maps and GPS. The trail started off wide and well-maintained, but as I ventured deeper, it became narrow and overgrown, the trees pressing in from all sides. The air was cool and damp, carrying the earthy scent of wet leaves and pine. I could hear the distant sound of water trickling, probably a stream winding through the forest somewhere off the path. I wasn't afraid. I'd hiked in plenty of remote places before and I knew how to navigate. But something about Black Hollow felt different. The deeper I went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The trees were tall and twisted, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers, and the forest floor was littered with thick underbrush that seemed to swallow sound. The only noise was my own footsteps and the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. The deeper I went, the quieter it got, as if the forest was holding its breath. There were no bird calls, no insects buzzing, just an eerie, unnatural silence that made my skin crawl. After about an hour, I reached a fork in the trail. The left path was marked with a faded sign pointing toward a lookout point, while the right was unmarked and overgrown, barely more than a deer trail. According to my research, the unmarked trail was where the missing hikers had last been seen. I hesitated, glancing down the narrow path. The trees grew denser, the shadows darker, and the air felt heavier, almost suffocating. But I hadn't come all this way just to play it safe. I took a deep breath and turned onto the unmarked trail, pushing through the thick underbrush. The trail was rough, barely visible beneath the layers of fallen leaves and rotting branches. I had to duck under low-hanging limbs and step carefully over roots that jutted up like traps. The further I went, the more disoriented I felt. My GPS kept glitching, the screen flickering and jumping as if the signal was being blocked. I tried to keep my bearings, using the sun's position as a guide, but the sky was completely obscured by the thick canopy above. It was like being in a different world, cut off from everything outside the forest. After another hour, I came across something that stopped me in my tracks. It was a small campsite, abandoned and overgrown. A tent, half collapsed and covered in moss, with old camping gear strewn about. It looked like it had been there for years, untouched and forgotten. I knelt down examining the remains. There was a backpack, its contents spilled out, a flashlight with dead batteries, a water bottle half full of murky liquid, and a notebook. The pages were damp and stuck together, but I carefully pried it open, hoping to find some clue about who had been here. Most of the writing was illegible, smeared by rain and time, but one page stood out. The handwriting was frantic, the letters slanted and uneven. "It watches from the trees. Don't look at it. Don't follow the voices." A chill ran down my spine. I shoved the notebook into my bag, my mind racing. What had they seen? What had they heard? I scanned the surrounding trees, half expecting to see someone, or something, watching from the shadows. But there was nothing, just the dense, impenetrable forest and the faint rustling of leaves in the breeze. I kept moving, but now every step felt heavier. Every shadow seemed to shift and writhe in the corners of my vision. I tried to focus, to stay on the barely visible trail, but the forest felt like it was closing in, the trees pressing closer with each passing moment. Then I heard it, a soft, distant whisper carried on the wind. At first I thought it was just the breeze, but as I listened, I realized it was words, faint, indistinct, like someone was speaking just out of earshot. My heart pounded in my chest as I strained to hear, the words drifting in and out of comprehension. "Help, please, this way." The voice was weak, desperate, and it seemed to be coming from deeper in the forest, off the trail. I knew better than to follow strange noises in an unfamiliar place, especially one with a history like this. But something in the voice tugged at me, a primal need to help, to find whoever was out there. I left the trail, pushing through the dense underbrush, the voice growing louder with each step. The trees seemed to shift around me, the path behind me vanishing as I ventured further into the uncharted woods. My phone was useless now, the screen frozen and unresponsive, the compass spinning wildly. The whispers grew more insistent, echoing from every direction, overlapping in a chorus of desperate pleas. It wasn't just one voice anymore. It was many, all calling out, all begging for help. I couldn't tell where they were coming from. Every direction seemed wrong. Every step took me deeper into the maze of trees. Panic set in as I realized I was completely lost. The whispers became frantic, almost angry, the words blurring together into a cacophony of noise that clawed at my mind. I spun around trying to find the trail, but the forest had swallowed it whole. I stumbled forward, tripping over roots and rocks, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The air was thick and humid, and the trees pressed in so tightly that I could barely see the sky above. I tried to backtrack, but nothing looked familiar. It was like the forest was shifting around me, rearranging itself to keep me trapped. The whispers were louder now, so loud that they drowned out my own thoughts. I clamped my hands over my ears, trying to block them out, but they seeped through, filling my head with a constant, droning chant. Then I saw it, a figure standing just ahead, barely visible through the dense trees. It was tall and thin, its body distorted and unnatural, like it was made of shadows. I blinked, trying to clear my vision, but the figure didn't move. It just stood there watching me with hollow eyes. I took a step back, my breath catching in my throat. The figure mirrored my movement, stepping forward as I stepped back. It was like looking into a warped mirror, the figure's movements jerky and wrong, as if it was struggling to mimic me. I turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush, branches tearing at my clothes and skin. The whispers grew into a deafening roar, the figure's presence pressing on me like a physical weight. I didn't dare look back, too terrified of what I might see. I ran until my lungs burned, until my legs felt like they were going to give out. Finally, I burst through the tree line and stumbled onto the main trail, collapsing onto the ground in a heap. The whispers stopped, replaced by the normal sounds of the forest, birds, rustling leaves, the distant babble of a stream. I scrambled to my feet, looking back into the woods. There was no sign of the figure, no sign of anything unusual. Just the trees and the underbrush, dense and impenetrable. I didn't waste any time. I ran back to my car, not stopping until I was safely behind the wheel with the doors locked. I drove out of there as fast as I could, not daring to look back. When I got home, I pulled out the notebook I'd found at the abandoned campsite. The pages were still damp, the words smeared, but one phrase stood out, clear and chilling. It doesn't let you leave. Once you hear the voices, it's already too late. I don't know what I saw in Black Hollow or what happened to the missing hikers. All I know is that something is out there, something that watches, waits, and calls out to those who stray too far from the path. I haven't gone back to the woods since, and sometimes late at night when everything is quiet, I think I can still hear it, a faint whisper, just on the edge of hearing, calling my name from somewhere deep in the dark. I've always been an outdoorsy person, camping, hiking, anything that got me out of the city and into nature. I was there for it. So when my friends and I decided to go on a camping trip in the Deep Pines National Forest, I was all in. It was supposed to be a weekend getaway, just a chance to disconnect, sit by a fire, and tell ghost stories under the stars. We picked a spot deep in the woods, far from the main campsites where families and RVs usually gathered. We wanted solitude, a place where we wouldn't be disturbed by other campers or the sounds of civilization. After a few hours of hiking, we found the perfect spot, a small clearing surrounded by tall, dense pines, with a stream nearby for water. It was perfect. We set up our tents, gathered firewood, and spent the day exploring the surrounding area. As the sun set, we settled in around the fire, laughing and swapping stories, the flames casting flickering shadows on the trees. It was exactly the kind of peaceful escape we'd been looking for. That first night, everything was fine. We stayed up late, joking and drinking, the forest alive with the sounds of crickets and the occasional hoot of an owl. I remember feeling a deep sense of calm as I drifted off to sleep in my tent, the gentle rustling of the trees lulling me into a dreamless slumber. But the second night, things started to get weird. We were sitting around the fire again, talking and roasting marshmallows when we heard it. A distant, rhythmic thumping coming from the woods. At first we thought it was a woodpecker or some animal moving through the underbrush, but the sound was too steady, too deliberate. It was like someone was pounding on a tree with a heavy stick over and over, each thump echoing through the quiet forest. We fell silent, straining to hear. The noise would stop, then start again, coming from a different direction, like it was circling us. One of my friends, Jake, grabbed a flashlight and stood up, shining it into the darkness. "Probably just some idiot trying to mess with us," he said, trying to sound confident. But I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes kept darting to the shadows just beyond the firelight. We all agreed it was probably nothing, a stray animal, maybe another camper who'd gotten lost. But the thumping continued, slow and deliberate, moving from one side of the camp to the other, like it was testing the boundaries of the light. Eventually the noise stopped, and we convinced ourselves that it was just our imaginations running wild. We tried to get back into the rhythm of our campfire chat, but the mood was different now, the lightheartedness replaced with a sense of unease. When we finally turned in for the night, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I woke up sometime in the early morning, a chill running through my body. The fire had died down to glowing embers, and the night was pitch black, the moon hidden behind thick clouds. As I lay there, staring at the roof of my tent, I heard a faint, raspy whisper. It was so quiet at first that I thought it was the wind, but as I listened, I realized it was something else. Words, barely audible, like someone speaking just outside my tent. I held my breath, straining to hear. The whispers were soft and disjointed, like a conversation I couldn't quite make out. I turned my head slowly, looking toward the zipper of my tent, and that's when I saw it, a shadow moving across the fabric, slow and deliberate. My heart pounded in my chest. I wanted to call out to my friends, but the words caught in my throat. The shadow paused, lingering in front of my tent, and I could hear the faint crunch of footsteps on the pine needles outside. I stayed as still as I could, barely daring to breathe, watching as the shadow moved away, disappearing into the darkness. The whispers faded, replaced by the rustling of leaves and the distant call of an owl. I lay there for what felt like hours, too terrified to move, until exhaustion finally pulled me back into a fitful sleep. When morning came, I stumbled out of my tent, my body aching and my mind still foggy from the restless night. My friends were already up, their faces pale and drawn. Jake was pacing by the fire pit, while Sarah and Mia sat on a log, whispering to each other. "You guys hear that last night?" Jake asked, stopping in his tracks when he saw me. "The whispers?" I nodded, my mouth dry. "Yeah, and someone was outside my tent." Sarah looked up, her eyes wide. "I heard it too. I thought I was dreaming, but—" She trailed off, glancing nervously at the surrounding trees. We all exchanged uneasy glances, the realization sinking in that whatever had happened the night before wasn't just a shared nightmare. We decided to pack up and head out early. None of us wanted to stay another night. As we packed, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every so often, I'd catch a flicker of movement in the corner of my eye, a dark shape darting between the trees. I tried to tell myself it was just nerves, but the feeling of eyes on me never went away. As we hiked back toward the main trail, the forest felt different. The usual sounds of birds and rustling leaves were gone, replaced by an oppressive silence that made my skin crawl. Every snap of a twig or crunch of leaves made us jump, our nerves frayed and raw. About halfway back, we came across something that made us all stop in our tracks. Hanging from a low branch right in the middle of the path was a small bundle made of sticks and twine, shaped like a crude human figure. It swayed gently in the breeze, twisting on its string. "What the hell is that?" Mia whispered, her voice trembling. Jake stepped forward, reaching up to take it down, but I grabbed his arm, stopping him. "Don't touch it," I said, my voice harsher than I intended. "Let's just go." We hurried past the figure, none of us daring to look back. The rest of the hike was a blur of adrenaline and fear, each of us driven by the unspoken need to get as far away from that place as possible. We finally reached the parking lot, the sight of our cars a welcome relief. As we loaded up our gear, I glanced back at the trailhead, half expecting to see something watching us from the shadows. But there was nothing, just the still, silent forest. We didn't talk much on the drive back, each of us lost in our thoughts trying to process what had happened. We all promised to keep in touch, but after that trip, we drifted apart. I haven't been camping since, and every time I think about it, I feel a cold knot of dread twist in my stomach. A few weeks later, I got curious and looked up stories about the area, trying to find some explanation for what we'd experienced. I found old reports of missing hikers, strange sightings, and whispers of ancient forgotten rituals performed in those woods. Some said the forest was haunted, others claimed it was cursed, but no one could agree on what was out there. But every account mentioned the same thing, the feeling of being watched, the whispers in the dark, and the strange figures made of sticks and twine, hung as warnings, or perhaps invitations. I try not to think about what would have happened if we'd stayed another night. But sometimes, when I'm alone in my apartment, I swear I hear it again. The faint, raspy whispers, like a conversation just out of reach, and the soft crunch of footsteps outside my window. And I know deep down that whatever was in those woods is still out there, watching, waiting for the next camper to wander too far from the beaten path. I've been a long-haul truck driver for nearly 15 years, and I've seen my share of strange things on the road. You get used to the isolation, the late nights, and the endless stretches of empty highway. I've driven through blizzards, fog so thick you can't see 10 feet ahead, and more flat tires than I care to count. But nothing ever shook me up as much as what happened on Route 609. It was supposed to be a routine job, a simple overnight haul delivering a load of construction equipment to a site a few states over. I'd driven the route dozens of times, knew every truck stop, rest area, and diner along the way. The dispatcher warned me that Route 609 had some road work going on, but I wasn't worried. just another detour. I left the depot just before dusk, hoping to beat the worst of the traffic. The first few hours were smooth. The radio played quietly. The hum of the engine kept me company, and the sun dipped below the horizon in a blaze of orange and pink. As night fell, I switched on my headlights, watching the pavement glide by under the steady beams. Around midnight, I hit the detour. The main highway was blocked off, orange cones and flashing lights forcing me onto Route 609, a narrow, winding road that snaked through dense, dark woods. I'd driven it once before, years ago, and remembered it being pretty desolate, the kind of place where you didn't see another car for miles. I settled in for a long, lonely drive, the road barely wide enough for my rig, with no shoulder and thick trees pressing in on either side. The GPS said I'd be on 609 for about 50 miles before reconnecting with the main highway. Easy enough, I thought. But then the fog rolled in. It started as a low mist creeping across the road, wisps of white swirling in my headlights. Within minutes, it thickened into a dense wall of gray, swallowing the trees and the road ahead. My visibility dropped to near zero, the world beyond my windshield disappearing into an impenetrable cloud. I slowed to a crawl, my hands gripping the wheel tightly, eyes straining to see the faint outline of the road. The radio cut out, replaced by a low static that buzzed in the background. I tried changing the station, but nothing came through, just static and faint whispers that I chalked up to signal interference. I turned it off, the silence somehow worse than the noise. As I crept along, I noticed something strange. There were no other cars, not a single one, not even a pair of taillights in the distance. It felt like I was the only person left in the world, driving through an endless sea of fog. My GPS kept glitching, the screen flickering as it tried to reroute, insisting that I'd gone off course even though I hadn't made a single turn. Then I saw the sign, "Welcome to Coldwater." It didn't make sense. Coldwater was a ghost town, abandoned years ago after the local mine shut down. I remembered reading about it, how the residents just up and left, leaving everything behind. I hadn't seen any signs for it on my route, and it shouldn't have been anywhere near 609. I tried to shake it off as a mistake, maybe some prank or an old sign left behind. But as I kept driving, the road signs kept insisting I was heading deeper into Coldwater. My gut tightened. I wanted to turn around, but the road was too narrow and the fog was too thick. I told myself to keep going, that the road would eventually connect back to the highway. I just needed to stay calm. The fog pressed in closer, swirling around the truck like it was alive. My headlights reflected off the thick mist, casting weird, shifting shadows that played tricks on my eyes. I thought I saw movement, a figure darting across the road just at the edge of the light. I slammed on the brakes, my heart pounding, but there was nothing there. Just fog and the gnarled silhouettes of trees. I kept going, slower now, my nerves on edge. That's when I saw it, a figure standing on the side of the road. It was a man, tall and thin, wearing a tattered jacket and a wide-brimmed hat that cast his face in shadow. He didn't move, just stood there watching as I passed. I tried to get a good look at his face, but the fog distorted everything, making it seem like his features were shifting, changing as I drove by. I didn't stop. I didn't even slow down. Something about him sent a chill down my spine, and I just wanted to get the hell out of there. But as I glanced in the rearview mirror, I saw him again, standing in the exact same spot like he hadn't moved at all. Only this time his head was turned, facing my truck, those shifting shadows where his face should be. I kept driving, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. The fog grew thicker, and the road signs started to change. They were old, rusted, the words barely visible. I caught glimpses of names I didn't recognize, places that shouldn't have been anywhere near my route. Each time I passed one, the same sinking feeling gripped me. I was lost, truly lost. And then I saw the gas station. It appeared out of the fog like a mirage, its flickering neon sign struggling to stay lit. I pulled in, desperate for some human contact, someone who could tell me where the hell I was. The station was run down, the pumps rusted, and the windows covered in grime, but the lights were on, and I could see someone inside, a figure moving behind the counter. I parked and got out, the cold night air hitting me like a slap. The fog was thicker on the ground, swirling around my legs as I walked to the door. I pushed it open, the bell above the door jingling softly. The man behind the counter looked up, his eyes sunken and hollow. He didn't say anything, just watched me with a vacant stare. "Hey," I said, trying to sound casual despite the unease crawling up my spine. "I think I'm lost. Can you tell me how to get back to the main highway?" The man just stared, his expression blank. The store was silent. No music, no hum of a refrigerator. Just the faint crackle of a light bulb struggling to stay lit. I repeated my question, louder this time, but he didn't respond. He just lifted a bony finger and pointed to a map pinned to the wall. I walked over, my footsteps echoing in the empty store. The map was old, yellowed with age, but I could make out Route 609 winding through a tangle of smaller roads. I scanned it, looking for familiar names, but nothing matched what I remembered. The names were wrong, the roads twisting in impossible ways. And then I saw it, Coldwater, right in the center of the map, circled in red. I turned back to the counter, but the man was gone. The store was empty, the lights flickering. I backed away, my pulse quickening, and stumbled outside. The fog was thicker now, almost suffocating, and as I looked around, I realized something that made my blood run cold. The truck was gone. My rig, my lifeline, was nowhere to be seen. I ran to where I'd parked it, but there was nothing. Just empty asphalt and that suffocating fog. Panic surged through me. I fumbled for my phone, but it was dead, the screen black no matter how many times I tried to turn it on. I was stranded. I started walking, trying to find anything that looked familiar. But the road just kept twisting and turning, leading me deeper into the fog. My footsteps echoed strangely, like the sound was being swallowed by the mist. I felt disoriented, like the ground was shifting beneath me, each step harder than the last. Then I heard it, a low rumble in the distance, growing louder. Headlights pierced through the fog, and I saw my truck barreling down the road, heading straight for me. I dove out of the way, hitting the ground hard as the rig roared past, horn blaring. I scrambled to my feet, heart racing, but the truck was gone. It had vanished into the fog, leaving no trace behind. I stood there, breathing hard, my mind spinning. It was my truck. I'd seen my own license plate, my own load, but no one was driving. I ran in the direction the truck had gone, desperate to catch up, to find anything that made sense. But the fog seemed to close in tighter, the road stretching on endlessly. I ran until my legs burned, until my lungs ached. But there was no sign of the truck, no sign of anything but the fog and the endless winding road. Eventually I collapsed, the cold seeping into my bones. I don't know how long I lay there, staring up at the swirling mist, listening to the distant rumble of an engine that never came closer. I must have drifted off or passed out, because the next thing I knew, I was waking up in my truck, parked at a rest stop miles away from Route 609. I checked my watch. Hours had passed, but I couldn't remember how I'd gotten there. My phone was working again, and the GPS showed me on the correct route, miles from where I'd gone off course. Everything seemed normal, except for the note on my dashboard written in a shaky hand that wasn't mine. I've always loved traveling, but sometimes that means ending up in some pretty weird places. I'm not picky when it comes to hotels. Usually, I just need a bed, a shower, and Wi-Fi. But last month I ended up in a hotel that I'll never forget, and for all the wrong reasons. I was on a business trip to a small town I'd never heard of, the kind of place that seemed to close down after dark. My original booking fell through due to a plumbing issue, so I had to scramble for another place to stay. That's how I ended up at the Redwood Inn, a dated, slightly run-down hotel just off the highway. It wasn't much to look at, a squat 4-story building with faded red paint and a flickering neon sign, but it was cheap, and at that point I didn't have any other options. I checked in late, the lobby empty except for a sleepy-looking clerk behind the counter. He handed me a key, an actual key, not one of those card things, and told me I was in room 413. I thought it was odd since the hotel didn't look like it had more than 3 floors, but I didn't question it. I was tired and just wanted to get some sleep. The elevator creaked and groaned as it took me up, the old gears grinding in a way that made me hold my breath, hoping it wouldn't get stuck. When the doors opened, I stepped out into a dimly lit hallway that smelled faintly of mildew and something sweet like rotting flowers. The carpet was a garish red pattern that had faded unevenly over the years, and the walls were lined with old, dusty paintings of places I didn't recognize. Room 413 was at the very end of the hallway. As I approached, I noticed the door looked different from the others, older, with deep scratches near the handle, like someone had tried to claw their way out. The key felt heavy in my hand as I unlocked the door, the sound of the bolt sliding back echoing down the empty corridor. The room was strange. It looked like it hadn't been updated in decades. The wallpaper was peeling in the corners, and the bedspread was a garish floral pattern that matched the carpet in the worst way. A small flickering lamp on the bedside table cast long, eerie shadows across the walls. The air was musty, and there was a faint hum that I couldn't quite place, like an old appliance struggling to stay alive. I tossed my bag on the bed and tried to settle in, but something felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it, but there was this heavy, oppressive feeling in the air, like the room was watching me. I shrugged it off as exhaustion and grabbed the remote to turn on the TV, but no matter what button I pressed, it wouldn't turn on. I gave up and decided to get some sleep, hoping that everything would feel less weird in the morning. As I lay there staring at the ceiling, I heard it, the faintest sound of static, like a radio struggling to find a station. It was so low I thought I might be imagining it, but as I strained to listen, it grew louder, a soft whispering noise coming from somewhere in the room. I sat up, heart pounding, and glanced around. The room was still, the shadows flickering as the lamp buzzed softly. Then out of the corner of my eye, I saw it, a figure standing in the corner of the room, just beyond the reach of the lamp's light. My breath caught in my throat as I squinted into the darkness, trying to make out the shape. It was tall and thin, with unnaturally long limbs that seemed to stretch toward the ceiling. Its head was cocked to the side, as if observing me, but I couldn't see any eyes, just a dark, featureless silhouette. I fumbled for the lamp, trying to turn up the light, but the bulb flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. I scrambled out of bed, my heart racing, and ran for the door. My hands shook as I fumbled with the lock, the metal cold and unyielding under my fingers. When I finally wrenched the door open, I bolted into the hallway, nearly tripping over my own feet in my rush to get out. The hallway was empty, the dim lights casting long shadows that seemed to dance along the walls. I glanced back at the room, expecting to see the figure standing in the doorway, but the door was shut tight, as if I'd never opened it. I hurried to the elevator and jabbed the button, desperate to get back to the lobby. The ride down was agonizingly slow, each creak and groan of the elevator filling the silence. When the doors finally opened, I rushed out, my pulse still racing. The clerk looked up from the front desk, his expression blank. "I need a different room," I blurted out. "There's something wrong with 413. The clerk's eyes flicked to the key in my hand, then back to me. He frowned slightly, as if confused. "Room 413, he repeated, his voice flat. "We don't have a room 413. I stared at him, my mind spinning. "What are you talking about? I was just there." He shook his head slowly, a look of concern crossing his face. "We only have 3 floors. You must be mistaken." I felt a chill run down my spine. I pulled out the key and held it up, but the number on the keychain wasn't 413 anymore. It was 103, one of the rooms on the first floor. I blinked, my thoughts scrambling to make sense of it, but the clerk just gave me a sympathetic look and handed me a new key. "Here, take room 105. It's just down the hall." I took the key numbly and headed to the new room, my mind racing with a million questions. Room 105 was ordinary. just like you'd expect in an old motel. A bed, a TV, nothing strange. I locked the door and sat on the bed staring at the keychain in my hand, trying to piece together what had happened. The night passed slowly, every creak of the building setting my nerves on edge. But nothing happened. No whispers, no shadows, just the faint sound of traffic from the highway outside. In the morning, I checked out as quickly as I could. The clerk was different this time, an older woman who smiled politely as I handed over the key. I asked her about room 413, but she just gave me a puzzled look. "There's no room 413 here, dear," she said with a chuckle. "Never has been." I left the Redwood Inn feeling more confused than ever. I got in my car and pulled out my phone, looking for any mention of room 413 online. That's when I found it. A thread on an old forum about urban legends and haunted places. Buried in the comments was a mention of the Redwood Inn and room 413. According to the post, room 413 was once real, back when the hotel was first built in the 1950s. A guest had gone missing there, vanishing without a trace. The room was sealed off after that, closed down and forgotten as the years passed. But every so often, guests would report strange occurrences, hearing whispers, seeing figures, and sometimes even finding themselves in a room that shouldn't exist. I don't know what I experienced that night. Maybe it was just my imagination, a trick of the light, or maybe it was something else, something tied to that missing guest from decades ago. All I know is that I'll never set foot in the Redwood Inn again. And if you ever find yourself there, remember, there's no room 413. But if you're not careful, you just might end up there anyway, trapped in a place that refuses to be forgotten. Small towns always have their secrets, but Minefield was different. Nestled deep in the Appalachian Mountains, it was one of those places that didn't even show up on most maps. I'd never heard of it until my sister Emily disappeared there. She'd been driving cross-country, documenting her journey for a travel blog she'd been building for years. Her last known location pinged in Minefield. And then, nothing. No calls, no posts, no trace. Just gone. The police tried, but they couldn't find anything. No one seemed to know where she went after arriving in Minefield. I couldn't sit back and do nothing, so I packed up and drove out there myself. It was a long, winding drive through dense forest and narrow roads that seemed to close in the deeper I went. Finally, the GPS signaled I was there. I rolled into Minefield late afternoon, the town looking as unremarkable as any other small, forgotten place. Minefield wasn't big, just a main street with a few shops, a gas station, and a diner. The buildings were old, the paint faded and peeling, giving the place a washed-out look like it hadn't changed in decades. The few people I saw didn't pay me much attention. They just went about their business with dull, uninterested expressions. There was a strange stillness in the air, like the town was stuck in time. I parked by the diner, figuring it was as good a place as any to start asking questions. The bell above the door jingled as I walked in, and a waitress behind the counter gave me a tired smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "What can I get you?" she asked, her voice flat. "I'm looking for my sister," I said, showing her a picture of Emily. "She came through here about a week ago. Have you seen her?" The waitress glanced at the photo, then shook her head. "Can't say I have. Not many folks stop here anymore." A man at the counter turned to look at me, his eyes narrowing. "People come and go," he said, his voice raspy. "But some don't leave." I felt a shiver run down my spine at his words. The waitress shot him a look, then turned back to me. "You might want to check with the sheriff. His office is down the street." I thanked her and headed out, my nerves fraying at the edges. The sheriff's office was a small, squat building with a single cruiser parked out front. Inside, the sheriff, a gruff, middle-aged man with a thick mustache, listened as I explained my sister's disappearance. He nodded, but his expression was guarded. "We've been looking," he said, leaning back in his chair. "We get folks going missing now and then. Could be she just got lost." Lost. That word didn't sit right. Emily was experienced, careful. She wouldn't just disappear without a trace. I pressed him for more, but he just shrugged, like it was out of his hands. As I walked back to my car, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The whole town felt wrong, like it was wearing a mask that didn't quite fit. I decided to stay the night, hoping I'd get a chance to ask more people if they'd seen Emily. I found a small motel on the edge of town. The owner, an elderly woman with a faraway look in her eyes, checked me in without a word, handing me the key with a shaky hand. The room was basic, just a bed, a TV, and a window that overlooked the forest. As night fell, the town grew quiet. Too quiet. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening to the occasional creak of the building settling. At some point I drifted off, but it wasn't long before I was jolted awake by a noise outside my window. It was faint at first, like a soft, distant hum. I got up and peered outside, but all I could see were the trees swaying in the darkness. The hum grew louder, more rhythmic, like a chant almost. I opened the window a crack, and that's when I heard it clearly, a low, droning voice repeating the same phrase over and over. I couldn't make out the words, but it sent a chill down my spine. I grabbed my flashlight and headed outside, the cold night air prickling my skin. I followed the sound, my heart racing as I moved through the trees. The chanting grew louder, leading me deeper into the woods. My flashlight flickered, the beam cutting through the darkness, and that's when I saw them. A group of people standing in a circle around an old gnarled tree. They were dressed in plain clothes, their faces obscured by shadow, and they were all chanting in unison, their voices blending into a haunting melody. I watched, frozen, as they swayed back and forth, their movements slow and deliberate. Then I saw her, Emily. She was standing in the circle, her eyes closed, moving with the others, relief and terror washed over me at the same time. I called out to her, but my voice was swallowed by the chanting. I stepped closer, my foot snapping a twig, and suddenly the chanting stopped. The group turned as one, their faces pale and expressionless, their eyes fixed on me. Emily's gaze met mine, but there was no recognition in her eyes, just a blank, empty stare. I called her name again, but she didn't move, didn't blink. It was like she was in a trance, caught in some kind of spell. "Emily," I shouted, reaching for her, but one of the figures stepped forward, blocking my path. The chanting started up again, louder this time, filling the air with that low, droning hum. I tried to push past, but the figure grabbed my arm with a grip like iron, pulling me back. "Leave," a voice whispered, cold and harsh. "She belongs to the town now." I stumbled back, fear gripping me as the chanting grew deafening. The circle tightened around Emily, their movements frantic and synchronized, and I knew I couldn't fight them all. I turned and ran, crashing through the woods, the chanting echoing in my ears. I didn't stop until I reached the motel, my chest heaving and my mind reeling. I locked the door and slumped against it, trying to catch my breath. The town was quiet again, the chanting gone, but the image of Emily's empty eyes was burned into my mind. I grabbed my keys and threw my things into my bag, desperate to leave. I drove through the night, the road twisting and turning as if trying to keep me trapped. I didn't stop until I was miles away, the sun beginning to rise over the horizon. I called the police in the nearest town, but when they went to Minefield, they found nothing. No chanting, no group, no sign of Emily. Just an empty town that didn't seem to care about the people it swallowed. I've never been able to find her. It's like she vanished into thin air, taken by the town that shouldn't exist. Sometimes, late at night, I hear that chanting in my dreams, pulling me back to that dark place. I wake up in a cold sweat, her face still fresh in my mind, those empty eyes staring back at me. I keep searching, but Minefield is like a ghost, never in the same place twice, always shifting, always hiding. It's taken others, I'm sure of it. And somewhere out there it's still waiting, calling to those who stray too close, ready to take them too. And if you ever hear that low droning hum on a dark road through the mountains, turn around. Don't follow it, because once Minefield has you, it doesn't let go, not ever. Camping in the woods has always been my go-to escape. There's nothing like the crackle of a campfire, the smell of pine, and the feeling of being miles away from the chaos of everyday life. So when my friend suggested a weekend camping trip in the Whispering Pines forest, I was all in. The forest had a reputation, tales of strange noises, shadowy figures, and hikers who'd gone missing over the years, but we chalked it up to local legends. Besides, we were seasoned campers. What could possibly go wrong? There were 4 of us, me, my best friend Mike, his girlfriend Jess, and her cousin Sarah. We arrived at the trailhead early on a Friday morning, loaded up with gear and ready for adventure. The plan was simple. Hike in a few miles, find a good spot near the river, and set up camp for the weekend. The weather was perfect. Clear skies and a crisp breeze that carried the scent of the forest. The first few hours of hiking were uneventful. The forest was beautiful, the sunlight filtering through the trees in dappled patches of gold. We joked and laughed, taking photos and enjoying the scenery. It wasn't until late afternoon that we found a suitable campsite, a small clearing just off the trail with plenty of space for our tents, and a perfect spot for a fire pit. We set up camp quickly and settled in, the woods around us slowly darkening as the sun dipped below the treetops. As night fell, the forest came alive with the sounds of crickets and the distant calls of owls. We built a fire, cooked dinner, and shared stories, mostly the usual camping fare about bears and embarrassing hiking mishaps. It was Mike who first brought up the legend of the Whispering Pines. "They say the forest is cursed," he began, his voice low and dramatic, clearly enjoying the chance to spook us. "That there's something in the woods that whispers to people, luring them off the trail. Once you hear it, you can't help but follow, and then you disappear." Jess rolled her eyes. "Come on, Mike, that's just campfire nonsense." But Sarah, who was usually the most skeptical among us, seemed uneasy. "Actually, my grandmother used to talk about this place. She said there were spirits in the trees, angry ones. She always told us to stay on the paths and never wander after dark." We laughed it off, but the mood had shifted. The forest around us felt darker, the shadows deeper. As the firelight flickered, I thought I saw movement at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the reach of the light. But when I looked again, there was nothing, just trees swaying in the wind. We called it a night soon after, retreating to our tents. I lay there, listening to the forest sounds, trying to ignore the strange sense of unease that had settled over me. Sometime after midnight, I was jolted awake by a noise, a soft, distant whispering. It was faint, like the wind brushing through the leaves, but it was rhythmic, deliberate, almost like a voice. I unzipped my tent and poked my head out, half expecting to see one of my friends messing around. But the campsite was still. The fire had died down to embers, casting a dull glow that barely lit the clearing. I looked over at Mike's tent, then Jess and Sarah's. Both were zipped shut, no signs of movement. Then I heard it again, a whisper just beyond the clearing, soft but insistent. I couldn't make out the words, but it was enough to send a chill down my spine. I glanced back at the tents, wanting to wake someone, but something stopped me. It was like the whispering was pulling at me, urging me to step into the darkness. I grabbed my flashlight and stood up, shining it toward the source of the sound. The beam cut through the trees, but all I saw were shadows and the dense underbrush. I took a step forward, then another, the whisper growing louder, more distinct. It was calling to me, coaxing me deeper into the woods. I don't know how far I walked. The whisper seemed to guide me, and I followed without thinking, the light from my flashlight flickering as the batteries began to die. The forest felt like it was closing in around me, the trees pressing closer with every step. The whispering was clearer now, almost like it was right beside me. But when I turned, there was no one there. I stopped, suddenly aware of how far I'd gone. I spun around, but the path was gone, replaced by a tangle of trees that all looked the same. My heart pounded as I realized I was lost. The whispering stopped, leaving me in a silence so heavy it felt like the air had been sucked out of my lungs. I tried to retrace my steps, but the forest was a maze. Every direction looked the same, and the more I walked, the more disoriented I became. My flashlight flickered one last time before going out completely, plunging me into darkness. Panic set in. I called out for my friends, but my voice seemed to get swallowed by the trees. I was about to give up when I saw a light, a faint, flickering glow through the trees. Hope surged through me and I stumbled toward it, praying it was the campfire. But as I got closer, I realized it wasn't the fire. It was a lantern, old and rusted, hanging from a tree branch. Beneath it, carved into the trunk, was a symbol, an intricate pattern of lines and circles that hurt my eyes to look at. The whispering started again, louder this time, coming from all around me. I backed away, but the trees seemed to shift, closing in. The whispering grew frantic, angry, like it was scolding me for trying to leave. I turned and ran, not caring about the branches that clawed at my skin or the roots that threatened to trip me. I just wanted out, away from the voices and the symbols that seemed to pulse in the darkness. Somehow I found my way back to the campsite. I burst into the clearing, gasping for breath, and collapsed by the dead fire. Mike, Jess, and Sarah were all standing there, looking as pale and shaken as I felt. "You heard it too, didn't you?" Mike asked, his voice trembling. We all nodded. Jess said she'd woken up to the sound of someone calling her name, while Sarah had seen figures moving between the trees, always just out of sight. We didn't sleep the rest of the night. We huddled by the fire, keeping it burning as best we could until the first light of dawn. As soon as the sun was up, we packed our gear and left, too scared to even eat breakfast. We didn't talk much on the hike back, each of us lost in our own thoughts, glancing nervously at the trees as if expecting to see something or someone watching. When we finally reached the trailhead, we reported what had happened to a park ranger. He listened, a serious expression on his face. But when we showed him where we'd camped, he frowned. "That area's been closed off for years," he said. "Too many disappearances. Folks say the forest doesn't like being disturbed. Best stick to the marked trails." We left Whispering Pines that day, vowing never to return. The whispers still haunt me, especially when I'm alone at night. Sometimes when it's quiet, I think I can still hear them, soft, distant voices calling from somewhere deep in the woods. And every so often, I wonder if I'd stayed just a little longer, listened just a little closer, if I'd have understood what they were trying to say, or if I'd have just been another lost soul swallowed by the Whispering Pines. In the heart of the quaint town of Eldridge, I had established my clockmaking shop, a small haven filled with timepieces of all kinds. The rhythmic ticking of clocks surrounded me like a comforting embrace, their brass gears and polished wood reflecting my lifelong passion. However, there was one clock that had always intrigued me, the grand clock that stood in the corner of my shop, its face cracked and its hands frozen at midnight. I had inherited it from my grandfather, who had whispered tales of its mysterious origins. According to him, it was said to have the ability to manipulate time in ways that could change the course of one's life. Skeptical but curious, I had spent years trying to restore it, but no matter what I did, it remained still. It was a chilly evening in November 2022 when I decided to take one last shot at fixing the clock. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the shop, I gathered my tools, determined to unlock its secrets. "Tonight is the night," I told myself, a mix of excitement and apprehension swirling in my stomach. As I worked, I noticed a faint glow emanating from the clock's interior. I leaned closer, squinting to see what it was. The gears began to shimmer with an ethereal light, illuminating the dark corners of my workshop. Suddenly, the clock chimed, the sound echoing through the air, causing me to jump back in surprise. "Is someone there?" I called out, my heart racing. The room fell silent, and I felt a chill creep up my spine. I had always believed that clocks held memories of the past, but this was different. There was a presence here, one that I could feel, but not see. Ignoring the unease settling in my gut, I continued to tinker with the clock, adjusting its mechanisms and checking the springs. As I worked, the whispers began, soft, melodic voices that seemed to drift through the air, weaving tales of love, loss, and longing. "Help us." they echoed, and I felt a pang of sadness. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice steady despite the rising tension. The clock chimed again, and the glow intensified, revealing a hidden compartment on the side of the clock. I hesitated, but curiosity got the better of me. I opened it, revealing a small, ornate key. The moment I held the key in my hand, the whispers grew louder, enveloping me. "Unlock the past," they urged, and I felt a strange compulsion to comply. I looked back at the clock, its face now glowing brightly, and it felt as if it was alive, urging me to discover its secrets. With a deep breath, I inserted the key into the lock on the clock's side. As I turned it, the hands of the clock began to move, and I was engulfed in a blinding light. When the light faded, I found myself in a different place, a grand ballroom filled with elegantly dressed people, the air thick with laughter and music. I was no longer in my shop. I was in the past, witnessing a lavish ball that seemed to have been plucked from a storybook. Confusion washed over me, but I felt an overwhelming sense of familiarity. Among the guests, I spotted a young couple dancing, their faces radiant with joy. I stepped closer, my heart racing as I recognized them. They were my grandparents, long before they had met. The whispers returned, weaving through the music, urging me to approach. "Help us," they echoed again. I realized then that I was not just a spectator. I was part of their story, a bridge between the past and present. Suddenly, the music faltered, and I saw a shadow lurking in the corner of the room. A figure cloaked in darkness watched my grandparents, its presence ominous and foreboding. "No!" I shouted, but my voice was lost in the din of laughter. The shadow moved closer, and I felt a surge of panic. I had to protect them. I rushed toward my grandparents, desperation fueling my actions. "Don't let him near you!" I cried, but they couldn't hear me. The shadow reached out, and just as it was about to engulf them, I remembered the key. I grasped it tightly, feeling its warmth pulse in my hand. "You're stronger than this," I shouted, channeling my energy into the key. In that moment, the room exploded with light, and the shadow recoiled, vanishing into the darkness. The music swelled, and my grandparents turned toward me, their expressions filled with gratitude. "Thank you," the young woman said, her voice echoing in my mind. "You've saved us." Before I could respond, the light intensified once more, and I was pulled back through time, landing back in my shop. The clock stood before me, its hands now moving steadily, the glow slowly fading. I felt a sense of peace wash over me, knowing that I had changed the course of history. I glanced at the small key, now a mere trinket in my hand. The whispers had quieted, but I could still feel their warmth, a reminder of the connection I had forged with my family's past. I knew then that the clock was not just a timepiece. It was a vessel for memories and a guardian of secrets. From that day forward, I dedicated my time to restoring the clock, ensuring that its magic would continue to thrive. I became the keeper of the stories it held, sharing them with anyone who stepped into my shop, and as the clock ticked steadily on, I could feel the echoes of my ancestors surrounding me, their whispers forever guiding me through time. The air was thick with an unsettling silence as I took my position at Hollow Pines Mall, a once thriving shopping center that had fallen into disrepair. The flickering fluorescent lights above cast long shadows, twisting the empty storefronts into grotesque shapes. I was the night security guard, a duty I picked up to pay the bills, but I quickly realized that this place was more than just abandoned. My shift started at 11 p.m., and as the clock struck midnight, I made my rounds. Each step echoed in the vast emptiness, and the stale scent of dust and decay hung in the air. As I walked by the old toy store, I could have sworn I heard a faint giggle. I paused, my heart racing. It must be the wind playing tricks on me, I thought. The mall was notorious for its dark history, Years ago, a family had vanished without a trace during a midnight shopping spree. Rumors swirled around the place like thick fog, and many believed the spirits of the lost family still roamed the halls, searching for a way out. I tried to shrug it off, but a chill crept down my spine. As I continued my rounds, I noticed the security monitors flickering to life. A shadow darted across the feed in the food court. I squinted at the screen, my heart pounding louder than the silence around me. I grabbed my flashlight and headed towards the food court, every instinct screaming that I should turn back. The moment I stepped inside, the temperature dropped. My breath formed clouds in the air as I scanned the area, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness. Suddenly I heard it again, the soft giggle, now closer. I turned quickly, but there was nothing, just the rustling of old banners hanging limply from the ceiling. "Hello," I called out, my voice quivering. Silence answered me. I moved deeper into the food court, my flashlight illuminating the remnants of a once bustling place. Empty tables, faded menus, and a broken soda machine. Another flicker from the monitors caught my eye. This time the figure was clearer, a small child standing in the center of the food court, facing away from the camera. My stomach twisted. "Hey, are you lost?" I shouted, hoping to dispel the tension coursing through me. The figure didn't move. With trembling hands I approached, the beam of my flashlight finally landing on the child. He wore old-fashioned clothing, a frayed hat atop his head, and his skin was pale, almost ghostly. His eyes were wide, staring straight ahead, unblinking. "You shouldn't be here," he whispered, his voice a mere breath. "Where are your parents?" I asked, my heart racing. "They can't help me," he replied, his gaze still fixed forward. "They left me here." Panic surged through me. I took a step back, my mind racing. This wasn't right. "Come with me. We'll find your parents," I urged. But the boy remained still, a statue in the darkness. Suddenly, the lights flickered violently, plunging me into darkness. I swung my flashlight around, but the beam wouldn't catch anything. The giggle erupted again, echoing in the void. My breath quickened. I stumbled back, my heart pounding louder than ever. When the lights returned, the boy was gone. In his place stood a tall, shadowy figure, its face obscured. I froze, terror coursing through my veins. "You shouldn't have come here," it hissed, a voice that felt like ice. I turned and ran, my instincts screaming at me to escape. I bolted toward the exit, but the mall seemed to stretch endlessly. I could hear the whispers of the lost family and the child's giggle, now mixed with cries for help. Finally, I burst through the doors and into the night air, gasping for breath. I turned to look back at the mall, a dark silhouette against the moonlit sky. The whispers faded, replaced by the sound of my racing heart. But as I turned to leave, a familiar voice called from behind me. "You shouldn't have left me," it said, echoing from the shadows. I spun around, flashlight in hand, but the boy stood there again, closer this time. "Now you're just like me," he whispered, and in that moment I understood. I had never been the security guard at Hollow Pines. I was the next lost soul, trapped in a place where time had forgotten its victims. The mall would never let me go. And as I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the glass doors, I realized the truth. I was now just another whisper in the dark. My name is Sarah Jensen, and I've been a security guard at Pine Hollow Cemetery for the last 2 years. Most nights are uneventful, but there's something about the cemetery that sends shivers down my spine, a feeling that I'm being watched, even when I'm alone. Perhaps it's the stories that circulate in the town, the ones about the restless spirits and the eerie happenings after dark. It was a chilly October night, the moon high in the sky and shrouded by thick clouds. I arrived for my shift just as the sun dipped below the horizon, plunging the cemetery into darkness. I parked my car at the entrance, the headlights illuminating rows of gravestones that stood like silent sentinels. Tonight felt different. A sense of unease hung in the air, thick and palpable. I grabbed my flashlight and began my patrol, the crunch of gravel beneath my boots echoing in the stillness. As I walked past the old oak tree at the center, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was following me. I turned abruptly, scanning the shadows, but there was nothing, just the wind whispering through the branches. After an hour of walking the grounds, I decided to take a break at the small shack where I kept my supplies. I settled in, sipping on my lukewarm coffee, when I heard a rustling sound outside. My heart raced as I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out. The fog had rolled in thick, wrapping around the gravestones like a shroud. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling slightly. No answer. The rustling grew louder, and I directed my beam of light toward the sound. It landed on a grave that had been freshly disturbed. The soil was loose, and I could see the edges of a wooden coffin peeking through. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. Who would disturb a grave in the middle of the night? Just as I was about to call it in, I heard a soft, mournful cry echoing through the cemetery. It was coming from the direction of the old mausoleum. Against my better judgment, I felt compelled to investigate. I walked slowly toward the structure, the heavy door creaking ominously as I pushed it open. Inside, the air was cool and damp, and the smell of mildew hung thick. My flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows along the stone walls. The crying grew louder, echoing off the cold marble. "Who's there?" I called, my voice barely above a whisper. The crying stopped abruptly. I felt my heart pounding in my chest as I turned to leave. But something caught my eye, a figure standing in the far corner of the mausoleum, partially obscured by the shadows. It was a woman, her long hair cascading down her back, her white dress flowing like mist around her feet. "Help me," she whispered, her voice hauntingly beautiful yet filled with despair. "Who are you?" I stammered, stepping back cautiously. "I am Eliza," she said, her gaze piercing through the darkness. "I was buried alive, hidden away from the world. I cannot rest until my story is told." My mind raced. I knew the stories of Eliza Hawthorne, a woman who had vanished decades ago, rumored to have been buried alive by her own family due to a misunderstanding. The townsfolk believed her spirit haunted the cemetery, seeking vengeance on those who wronged her. "I can help you," I said, the words tumbling out before I could think. "Tell me what I need to do." Eliza stepped closer, her eyes shimmering with a mix of hope and sorrow. "You must find the truth. The graves hold the secrets. You will see." Before I could respond, the ground beneath me trembled, and the mausoleum walls began to crack. I stumbled back, barely catching myself as the floor split open, revealing a dark void. I felt a pull, as if the very earth beneath me wanted to consume me. "Find the truth," Eliza cried, her voice echoing as she faded into the shadows. "They must know." Terrified, I raced out of the mausoleum, the ground shaking beneath me. I sprinted toward the entrance of the cemetery, the fog swirling around me. I needed to find the truth, but how? The next morning I met with the local historian, an old woman named Mrs. Abernathy. I told her everything I had experienced. Her eyes widened with recognition. "Eliza's story has been buried for too long. The truth lies not just in her grave, but in the records." Together we dug through decades of town archives, piecing together Eliza's life and the tragedy that had befallen her. It turned out she had been accused of witchcraft by her jealous sister, leading to her wrongful imprisonment and eventual burial. Armed with this knowledge, I arranged a small memorial at Eliza's grave, inviting the townspeople to hear the truth. As I spoke, I felt a strange sense of connection to the spirit. Eliza Hawthorne was a victim of fear and misunderstanding. It's time we remember her, not as a ghost, but as a woman who deserved her life. As I finished, a gentle breeze swept through the cemetery, and I felt a warmth surrounding me, as if Eliza was finally at peace. That night I returned to Pine Hollow Cemetery, my heart lighter than it had been. The air felt different, calm and serene. As I walked through the gravestones, I realized that I was no longer afraid. The shadows held no power over me. I had faced the darkness and brought the truth to light. But as I made my final rounds, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was not alone. I looked back toward the mausoleum, and there, just for a moment, I thought I saw Eliza's silhouette standing at the entrance, watching over the cemetery, grateful and free. From that night on, the cemetery felt different. The weight of despair had lifted, replaced by a sense of peace. And as I continued my work, I knew Eliza's story would never be forgotten again. I've been the night security guard at the abandoned Waverly Manor. The manor, a once grand estate nestled deep in the woods, had been left to decay for decades. Rumors of its haunted past were rampant in the nearby town, but I took the job to pay the bills, dismissing the ghost stories as mere folklore. The first few nights were uneventful, filled with the usual creaks and groans of an old building. But as I settled into my routine, I began to sense something off about the manor, an oppressive weight in the air that made my skin crawl. It wasn't until one particularly stormy night that I discovered the true nature of the place. The rain pelted against the windows as I made my rounds on the second floor. Thunder rumbled in the distance, and the dim lighting flickered ominously. I was checking the old library when I heard something, a soft whisper, barely audible over the storm. It seemed to be coming from the walls, echoing like a forgotten memory. "Help us!" I froze, my heart racing. I turned to leave, but the whispers grew louder, a chorus of voices pleading in unison. "Help us! Help us!" "Who's there?" I called out, my voice shaking. My flashlight flickered, casting long shadows across the room. The whispers faded momentarily, replaced by a chilling silence. I took a deep breath and decided to investigate. I followed the sound down the hallway, the whispers guiding me toward a door at the end that I had never noticed before. It was slightly ajar, the darkness inside beckoning me closer. With a deep sense of dread, I pushed the door open. The room was small and dimly lit, filled with dusty furniture covered in white sheets. In the center stood an old rocking chair, gently swaying as if someone had just risen from it. My heartbeat quickened as I stepped inside, the whispers growing louder and more frantic. "Help us, please!" I backed away, ready to flee, when I noticed a large, ornate mirror hanging on the far wall. It was covered in cobwebs, but something about it drew me in. As I approached, the whispers turned into desperate cries, echoing in my mind. "Look into the mirror." Against my better judgment, I leaned closer, peering into the glass. At first, I saw only my reflection, but then the image shifted. The mirror showed the room as it once was, filled with light, laughter, and the faces of children playing. But then it changed again, revealing a darker scene. The same children, trapped, their faces twisted in terror as they reached out for help. I stumbled back, terror gripping my chest. "What happened to them?" I whispered, but the whispers ceased, leaving only the sound of the storm outside. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind me, plunging the room into darkness. Panic surged through me as I fumbled for my flashlight, but the beam flickered and died. I was trapped, the oppressive darkness closing in around me. "Help us!" The voices pleaded once more, but this time they sounded different, angry and vengeful. I felt a cold breeze sweep through the room, and the whispers turned into wails of despair. "You're one of us now," they screamed, and I could feel their presence pressing against me, suffocating me with their grief. I dashed for the door, but it wouldn't budge. The walls seemed to close in, and the whispers morphed into a cacophony of screams. "Join us! Join us!" Now, just when I thought I would be consumed by the darkness, I remembered the emergency exit at the far end of the hallway. I focused on that thought, pushing my way through the suffocating darkness, feeling the air grow colder. With a surge of determination, I charged toward the door, slamming into it with all my strength. To my surprise, it swung open, and I stumbled into the hallway, gasping for breath. I sprinted down the corridor, the whispers still echoing behind me, clawing at my sanity. I reached the main entrance, my heart racing as I flung open the double doors and burst into the night. I didn't stop running until I reached my car, the cool air filling my lungs as I drove away from Waverly Manor, leaving the tortured souls behind. But as I glanced in the rearview mirror, my heart sank. I saw the reflection of the manor, but it wasn't empty. I could see shadows moving behind the windows, their faces twisted in anguish, their mouths open in silent screams. And just like that, I realized the truth. I hadn't escaped at all. The manor had claimed a piece of me, and I could still hear their whispers in the back of my mind. They weren't just trapped within the walls. They were now a part of me, and I knew I could never truly leave Waverly Manor behind. The first thing I noticed when I moved into the old Victorian house on Elm Street was the mirror. It was an ornate antique, framed in dark mahogany with intricate carvings that seemed almost to twist and writhe when I looked at them too long. It was placed in the hallway facing the front door. It didn't seem to fit the rest of the house's decor, which was otherwise a hodgepodge of modern and minimalist styles. I didn't think much of it at the time, though. The mirror was by far the most unsettling feature of the house. It wasn't until a month later that I realized just how much. It began with small things: a door creaking open on its own, a fleeting shadow in the corner of my eye. I dismissed these as the normal quirks of an old house settling, but they kept getting worse. One night I woke to the sound of footsteps echoing down the hallway. My heart pounded as I peered out from under the covers. The footsteps stopped outside my bedroom door, and I heard a faint whispering, soft, almost musical but unintelligible. I grabbed the flashlight from my nightstand and crept into the hall. The hallway was empty. The mirror stood there, reflecting nothing but darkness. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I forced myself to return to bed, chalking it up to an overactive imagination. The next day, I decided to clean the mirror, hoping that maybe a good scrub would help dispel whatever uneasy feelings I had about it. As I polished, I noticed something peculiar in the reflection. A dark shape, vaguely human, standing behind me. I spun around, but there was nothing there, just the empty hallway. It was then that I realized the mirror wasn't just reflecting the room. It seemed to be a window into another world. At first, it was just eerie, a dark shape that seemed to linger. But over the following weeks, the reflections became more vivid. I saw things that shouldn't have been there. A woman in a tattered dress, a child's hand reaching out, always just out of reach, always just out of sight. One evening, I was cleaning up after dinner when I heard the whispering again. It was louder this time, coming from the mirror. I approached it cautiously, my reflection seeming to move independently. As I drew closer, the whispering grew more insistent, a cacophony of desperate voices. "Help us," they seemed to say, "save us." I was drawn to the mirror as if it had a magnetic pull. My heart raced as I stared at the reflection, which was now showing a scene from a past long gone, a violent struggle, a dark figure dragging a woman across a room, and then nothing but darkness. That night, unable to sleep, I sat by the mirror staring at the distorted reflection. I saw myself as if through a fog, but something was different. My reflection didn't match my movements. It seemed to act independently, its expression growing darker, more malevolent. Suddenly, my reflection raised a hand and began to scratch at the surface of the mirror, as though trying to break free. I gasped and backed away, but the reflection's eyes, my eyes, were locked onto mine, filled with a torment I could not understand. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed a hammer from the toolbox and, with trembling hands, smashed the mirror. The shards exploded into 1,000 pieces, and for a moment, there was silence. I cleaned up the mess, tossing the broken glass into a garbage bag and feeling a strange sense of relief. But as I prepared for bed, I glanced at the wall where the mirror had been. My heart sank. There, Etched into the wall behind where the mirror had hung was an inscription in a dark, spidery script. "You were never alone." I stared at it, horror-stricken. The room felt colder, the shadows longer. I turned to go to bed, but as I looked back, I saw the reflection of the empty space where the mirror had been. My own face stared back at me, grinning with a malevolent glee I knew wasn't my own. And then I understood. The mirror had been a prison, and by destroying it, I had freed whatever had been trapped within. The malevolent presence was no longer confined to the glass. It was free, and it was now a part of me. As I lay in bed, I heard the whispering again, now coming from within my own mind. "Help us," it said. "Save us." But I knew the truth now. The mirror was not just a reflection. It was a gateway, and the horrors trapped behind it were never meant to be unleashed. And now, those horrors had a new home inside me. I never believed in ghosts, that is until I moved to Hollow Creek. When I first arrived, the place seemed like a quaint, old-fashioned town straight out of a postcard. Nestled in the mountains, it had picturesque streets and a small-town charm. But as the locals would say, the charm was a facade hiding something darker. The first few nights were peaceful, but then the sounds began. It started subtly, scratching noises in the walls, whispers in the dead of night. I tried to ignore them, telling myself it was just the house settling or my imagination running wild. But the noises persisted, growing louder and more urgent. Each night, it felt like someone, or something, was trying to communicate with me. One evening, as I was getting ready for bed, I heard a distinct, muffled voice coming from the attic. My curiosity overcame my fear, so I climbed the creaky steps to investigate. The attic was dusty and filled with forgotten relics. I rummaged through old trunks and boxes, hoping to find the source of the noise. And then I saw it, a mirror covered in a tattered cloth. I pulled the cloth off, revealing an ornate frame with a glass that seemed strangely dark. The voice grew louder, now a coherent whisper begging for help. I stared at the mirror, trying to see what was reflected. The glass was pitch black, like a void, and the whispers turned into pleading cries. Suddenly, a cold draft swept through the attic, extinguishing the single bulb above me. In the darkness, the whispers intensified into frantic screams. I fumbled for my phone and used its light to find my way out. As I descended the stairs, the whispers seemed to follow me, echoing through the house. I went to bed that night with a gnawing sense of dread. The next morning, I woke up to find that the mirror had somehow moved to the middle of my bedroom. My phone was on the floor, cracked. I didn't recall dropping it. I decided to confront the townsfolk about the mirror and the noises. To my surprise, they were reluctant to talk about it. It was only old Mr. Whitaker, who lived on the edge of town, that revealed something chilling. "Hollow Creek has its secrets," he said in a low, gravelly voice. "The mirror is a gateway, a way for the past to speak to the present." He explained that many years ago a family had lived in my house. They had vanished without a trace, leaving behind only the mirror. Rumors said that the mirror was cursed, trapping the souls of those who were unlucky enough to look into it. Determined to end the torment, I decided to destroy the mirror. That night I took a hammer to it, smashing the glass into shards. As each piece fell, the screams grew louder, reaching a deafening crescendo before abruptly stopping. Relieved, I thought the ordeal was over, but as I lay in bed, I noticed something disturbing. In the corner of my room, there was a new mirror, perfectly intact, with a familiar, ornate frame. My heart raced as I realized the chilling truth. The mirror had been replaced. The whispers began again, more desperate and chaotic than before. In a fit of panic, I grabbed my phone and took a picture of the mirror. The screen flickered, and then I saw something horrifying, a face in the reflection, staring back at me with hollow eyes. The face was mine, but distorted, twisted into a grotesque mask of anguish. And then it dawned on me. The mirror wasn't just a gateway, it was a prison. Every time someone tried to destroy it, the mirror absorbed their essence, trapping them inside. I had been trying to free myself from the mirror, but all I had done was become its newest inhabitant. As the realization sunk in, the mirror's whispers turned into a sinister laughter. My reflection grinned back at me with a malevolent glee. The mirror was my new home, and there was no escape. So now, as you watch this, know that if you hear scratching in the walls or whispers in the night, it's not just your imagination. It might be me, reaching out from the other side, begging for someone to hear my cries and set me free. But don't look too closely. You might just see your own face staring back at you, trapped in the eternal void of Hollow Creek. If you enjoyed this chilling tale, remember to like and subscribe for more spine-tingling stories. And maybe, just maybe, don't look too closely at your reflection tonight. My name is Clara Mills, and I've always been drawn to the art of photography. There's something magical about freezing a moment in time, capturing emotions that can be revisited forever. But my passion took a dark turn when I accepted a project to photograph the abandoned Ashwood Asylum on the outskirts of my hometown. They say the asylum is haunted, a place where the echoes of the past linger like shadows that refuse to fade. It was a chilly autumn afternoon when I arrived at the asylum. The sky was overcast, casting a gray pallor over the crumbling stone building. Vines crawled up the walls, and shattered windows gaped like empty eyes. I could feel the weight of history in the air, and as I stepped inside, a shiver ran down my spine. Equipped with my camera and a flashlight, I ventured deeper into the asylum. The hallways were narrow and lined with peeling paint, and each step I took echoed ominously against the walls. I set up my tripod in the main hall, where remnants of old chairs and rusted medical equipment lay scattered like forgotten memories. As I began taking photos, I felt an unsettling presence. The air grew thick, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I brushed it off as nerves. After all, this place was notorious for its tragic history. Patients had suffered here, subjected to inhumane treatments, and many had never left. I continued snapping pictures, each click of the shutter capturing the eerie beauty of decay. But as I reviewed the images on my camera, I noticed something strange. In the background of one photo, a dark figure stood just beyond the frame, faint but unmistakable. My heart raced and I felt a chill creep up my spine. Determined to find the source of the disturbance, I ventured further into the asylum, following the feeling that pulled me deeper. I climbed to the second floor, where the patient quarters were located. The door to one room stood ajar, and I could hear a faint whispering coming from within. "Hello?" I called out, but the whispers faded into silence. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was bare, save for a single fraying mattress in the corner and a large mirror that hung crookedly on the wall. As I approached the mirror, I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. My reflection stared back, but there was something else. Behind me, in the glass, stood the figure from the photograph. It was a woman, her features obscured by shadows, but her gaze was piercing, filled with sorrow and longing. I stumbled back, fear gripping me. "Who are you?" I whispered, my voice trembling. The woman's lips moved silently, but I couldn't hear her words. Suddenly, the room grew cold, and the whispers returned, swirling around me like a storm. I felt as if I were being drawn into the mirror, the edges of my vision blurring as the shadows deepened. "Help us," came a chorus of voices echoing in my mind. I felt a surge of panic, but the urge to understand compelled me to reach out to the mirror. My fingers grazed the surface, and in an instant, the world around me shifted. I was no longer in the room. Instead, I found myself in a dimly lit corridor filled with patients, lost souls wandering aimlessly, their faces etched with despair. I realized this was the asylum at its darkest, before it had been abandoned. The woman from the mirror stood beside me, her eyes filled with urgency. "Help them," she implored, pointing toward a group of patients huddled in a corner, their eyes hollow and pleading. I felt a wave of empathy wash over me. These were the souls trapped in the asylum, their pain echoing through time. "How?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Free their stories," she replied, her voice resonating in my mind. "Let the world remember them." With that, I was pulled back through the mirror, and I stumbled into the room once more, my heart racing. The shadows were still there, but now they felt different, less menacing, more desperate. I grabbed my camera, determined to capture their stories. I began to photograph the room, but this time I focused on the details, the cracks in the walls, the remnants of forgotten lives. As I snapped photos, the shadows began to swirl around me, coalescing into faint images of the patients, faces filled with anguish, longing for recognition. Each click of my camera seemed to release their stories, and with every image I felt their presence grow stronger. I could hear their whispers more clearly now, each one weaving a tale of sorrow and despair. I felt a connection to them, as if their pain was becoming a part of me. As the last light of day faded, I finally captured an image that felt complete. The room illuminated with a soft glow, and the woman from the mirror appeared beside me, her expression serene. "You've done it," she said, her voice a gentle whisper. "You've given us a voice." In that moment, the shadows around me began to dissolve, and I felt a rush of warmth enveloping me. The room was filled with light, and I realized the spirits were finally being released. As they faded into the ether, I felt a profound sense of peace wash over me. I left the asylum that night with a heavy heart but a lighter spirit. I had freed them, not just through my photographs but through the stories I would share. The images I captured would serve as a testament to the lives once lived within those walls, a reminder that they were not forgotten. Weeks later, I held an exhibition showcasing the photographs. The haunting beauty of the asylum, combined with the stories of its lost souls, resonated with everyone who viewed them. People came to learn, to remember, and to honor those who had suffered. As I stood among the crowd, I felt a presence beside me, warm and comforting. I glanced to my side, and for a fleeting moment I saw the woman from the mirror standing there smiling. I knew then that I had fulfilled my promise. The shadows of the asylum may have faded, but their stories would live on, forever captured in the frames of my photographs. I was their keeper, and through my lens, their voices would echo for generations to come. I'm an architect living in the small town of Hawthorne Creek. I've always had a fascination with old buildings. There's something magical about their history, the stories they hold within their walls. So, when I was hired to renovate the long-abandoned Hawthorne mansion, I felt like I had struck gold. Little did I know the mansion held secrets far darker than I could have ever imagined. The mansion was a sprawling estate that had been left to rot for decades. It loomed at the end of a long, winding driveway, its once grand facade now draped in ivy and shadow. As I walked through the creaking front door, I felt an inexplicable pull to explore every corner. The air was thick with dust, and sunlight filtered through the cracked windows, illuminating the faded grandeur of what once was. I spent the first few weeks cataloging what needed to be repaired. While I was excited to breathe new life into this forgotten relic, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It started as a whisper of unease, but as the days wore on, it grew into a palpable tension that clung to me like a shroud. One evening, as I was working late, I stumbled upon a door hidden behind a rotting bookshelf in the library. I had searched every inch of the house, yet this door had eluded me. It was old and heavy, adorned with intricate carvings that seemed to twist and writhe in the dim light. Curiosity overwhelmed me, and I pushed it open. What lay beyond was a narrow staircase spiraling down into darkness. My heart raced as I descended, each step echoing ominously in the silence. At the bottom, I found myself in a small, musty room. The air was stale, and the walls were lined with dusty shelves filled with forgotten trinkets and faded photographs. But what caught my eye was a large, ornate mirror leaning against the far wall. As I approached the mirror, I felt an odd sensation wash over me. The glass was cloudy, but as I wiped away the dust with my sleeve, my reflection became clearer. I looked different. My face seemed older, weary, as if the mirror was revealing the burdens I had yet to bear. Suddenly, I noticed something else. The reflection behind me wasn't just the dimly lit room. It was a scene unfolding in the past. I saw a lavish party, laughter echoing around me, and elegantly dressed guests dancing under chandeliers that sparkled with light. But the scene quickly turned dark. The joyous faces twisted into expressions of horror as they turned to look at me. I stumbled back, heart pounding, and the vision faded. Confused and shaken, I hurried back upstairs, trying to shake off what I had just experienced. But the next day, I couldn't help but return to the mirror, drawn by an inexplicable urge. This time, the reflection revealed a different moment, a woman standing in the same room, her face obscured by shadows but her eyes bright with anguish. She reached out, her lips moving as if trying to speak. I leaned closer, straining to hear her words, but they were lost in the silence. Days turned into weeks, and I found myself obsessively returning to that room. Each time I looked into the mirror, I witnessed fragments of the mansion's past. Parties, arguments, sorrow. I began to piece together the story of the Hawthorne family, a tragic tale of love, loss, and betrayal that had ended in a fire that consumed the mansion decades ago. But what haunted me most was the woman I kept seeing. She was always there, her expression filled with despair, her eyes pleading for something. I felt an overwhelming need to help her, to uncover the truth behind her sorrow. One stormy night, as thunder rumbled outside, I went down to the room once more. The mirror shimmered with an ethereal light, and the woman appeared again, more vivid than ever. This time I heard her voice, clear and desperate. "Find me. I am trapped." Without thinking, I reached out to touch the mirror's surface. The moment my fingers made contact, a surge of energy coursed through me, and the room around me warped and twisted. I was pulled into the mirror, and suddenly I was standing in the room with her. The air was heavy, filled with an unbearable sadness. "Who are you?" I asked, disoriented. "I am Eliza Hawthorne," she replied, her voice a haunting melody. "I was lost in the fire, but my spirit remains. I cannot move on until my story is told." "Your story?" I echoed, my heart racing. "What happened?" With a wave of her hand, the room transformed around me, revealing the events leading up to the fire. I saw a family torn apart by jealousy and betrayal, a lover scorned, and in the chaos, Eliza had perished, trapped in the flames. The vision faded, and I returned to the dark room, breathless and shaken. "I will help you," I promised, determined to free her spirit. "I will tell your story." As I emerged from the mirror, I knew what I had to do. I spent the next few weeks researching the Hawthorne family, digging through records and old newspaper clippings. I chronicled their lives, the love and loss that had consumed them, pouring my heart into every word. Finally, I published a book detailing their tragic tale. And as I held a copy in my hands, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. I returned to the mansion one last time, standing before the mirror. "Eliza, I've done it," I said, tears in my eyes. "You're free." In that moment, the room filled with a soft, warm light, and Eliza appeared before me, her face radiant and free of sorrow. "Thank you," she whispered, a smile breaking through the anguish. "I can finally move on." As the light enveloped her, I felt a rush of energy, and with a final glance she vanished, leaving only a lingering warmth behind. The mirror faded, its glass now reflecting only the empty room. I stepped back, filled with a bittersweet sense of closure. The mansion felt different now, lighter, as if the weight of its history had been lifted. I had saved Eliza, but as I turned to leave, I caught a glimpse of my reflection once more. I looked older, weary, but there was something else. a flicker of light in my eyes that hadn't been there before. I smiled, feeling a connection to the past that I would carry with me. The Hawthorne mansion would stand as a testament to the forgotten stories of those who came before, and I had become a part of that legacy. But as I stepped out into the sunlight, I couldn't shake the feeling that Eliza's story was just one of many, and that in the heart of every old building, there lay a forgotten room waiting to be discovered. I've always had a knack for fixing things. As a handyman living in a small suburban town, I've worked my fair share of odd jobs, but nothing could have prepared me for the peculiar request I received one chilly autumn evening. The call came from an elderly woman named Mrs. Whitaker, who lived in a creaky old house at the end of Maple Street. She mentioned strange noises coming from her basement, whispers, scratching sounds, and the occasional flicker of lights. At first, I thought it might just be an old house settling, but something in her voice sent a shiver down my spine. When I arrived at her home, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the yard. Mrs. Whitaker greeted me at the door, her frail figure wrapped in a shawl. "Thank you for coming, dear," she said, her eyes wide with worry. "It's been getting worse. I fear something is down there." I followed her inside, the air heavy with the scent of dust and faded memories. The house was filled with antiques, each telling a story of its own. As we descended the narrow staircase to the basement, the light flickered ominously. "It's down there," she whispered, her voice trembling. The basement door creaked open, revealing a dimly lit space cluttered with old furniture and boxes. The air was thick and musty, and as I stepped inside, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. I pulled out my flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness, revealing the remnants of a life once lived. I began inspecting the walls and the floor, looking for any signs of damage or pest infestations. That's when I heard it, a soft whisper, barely audible but distinct. "Help me. Help me." I froze, my heart racing. Was it just my mind playing tricks on me? I glanced at Mrs. Whitaker, who stood at the top of the stairs, worry etched on her face. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She nodded, her expression grave. "It's been calling for weeks. I'm afraid to go down there alone." Taking a deep breath, I decided to investigate further. I followed the sound deeper into the basement, my flashlight illuminating the cobwebs and dust motes dancing in the air. The whispers grew louder, swirling around me like a tempest. "Help me. Help me." Pushing through the unease, I ventured toward the far corner of the room, where I noticed a small door hidden behind stacks of boxes. It was old and weathered, as if it hadn't been opened in years. The whispers seemed to emanate from behind it, beckoning me closer. I reached for the doorknob, hesitating for a moment as a wave of dread washed over me. With a deep breath, I turned the knob and pulled the door open. It creaked loudly, revealing a narrow, dark passageway that seemed to go on forever. The whispers intensified, urging me to step inside. Against my better judgment, I stepped into the darkness, the air growing colder with each step. The passageway twisted and turned, and I felt disoriented. Just as I was about to turn back, I stumbled into a small, dimly lit room. What I saw took my breath away. The walls were covered in old photographs, each one depicting a family member of Mrs. Whitaker's, along with strange symbols and scrawls that seemed to pulse with energy. In the center of the room stood a small altar adorned with candles and trinkets, surrounded by a circle of salt. At that moment, I realized the whispers were not just echoes of the past. They were the trapped souls of those who had lived in this house, victims of a dark ritual gone wrong. I could feel their desperation, their longing for freedom. Suddenly, the atmosphere shifted, and I felt an oppressive force pressing against me. A shadow flickered at the edge of my vision, and I turned to see a dark figure lurking in the corner of the room. It was tall and featureless, a void that seemed to absorb the light. Fear gripped me, and I stumbled backward, trying to escape. "Help us!" The whispers cried out in unison, their voices rising in a desperate crescendo. The shadow advanced toward me, and I felt a cold breath at my neck, urging me to stay. In a moment of clarity, I remembered the salt circle. I rushed back to the entrance and grabbed a handful of salt from the altar, throwing it at the shadow. It shrieked a sound that vibrated through my bones, and the figure recoiled, retreating into the darkness. With adrenaline coursing through my veins, I dashed back through the passageway, the whispers now a chaotic roar. I burst through the small door and into the basement, slamming it shut behind me. I could still hear the whispers, but now they were mixed with a sense of clarity and purpose. Mrs. Whitaker stood at the top of the stairs, her eyes wide with fear. "What happened?" she asked, her voice trembling. "The house is haunted, but I think I can help," I said, breathless. "We need to perform a cleansing ritual to free the spirits." With her help, we gathered saji and salt from her kitchen and returned to the basement. As we lit the sage and sprinkled the salt in a protective circle, the whispers began to fade, replaced by a calm energy that enveloped us. As we completed the ritual, a warm light filled the room, and I felt the oppressive weight lift. The shadows receded, and the whispers transformed into soft, grateful murmurs. "Thank you. Thank you." When we finished, the basement felt lighter, the air no longer heavy with despair. Mrs. Whitaker looked at me, tears in her eyes. "You did it," she whispered, a smile breaking through her fear. But as I prepared to leave, I caught a glimpse of the photographs on the wall once more. Among them, one picture stood out, a photo of Mrs. Whitaker as a young woman, surrounded by the shadows I had encountered. It was then that I understood she had been the one to trap them, a guardian of the house, bound to keep the darkness at bay. As I stepped out into the crisp night air, I knew that while I had freed the trapped souls, I had also awakened something within Mrs. Whitaker, a darkness that would always linger in the shadows of her heart. And as I left, the whispers echoed softly behind me, a reminder that some shadows never truly fade away. I'm a writer, often seeking inspiration in the eerie corners of the world. It was during one such quest that I found myself in Hollow Creek, a small town shrouded in mystery and legends of ghostly encounters. The locals spoke in hushed tones of an abandoned house on the outskirts, known as the Eldridge Manor, where strange occurrences had been reported for generations. Intrigued, I rented a small cabin nearby and made plans to explore the manor the next day. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in deep reds and purples, I could feel an unsettling energy creeping into the air. I brushed off my apprehension, convinced that it would make for a compelling story. As I approached Eldridge Manor the following morning, the towering structure loomed before me, its windows like dark, hollow eyes watching my every move. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and the once grand facade now seemed to sag under the weight of time. I pushed open the creaking door and stepped inside, a shiver running down my spine as I crossed the threshold. The interior was a labyrinth of dust and shadows. As I explored room after room, I felt a strange sense of being watched. I set up my notebook on an old, rickety table and began to write, hoping the atmosphere would inspire me. But the longer I stayed, the heavier the air became. I could hear faint whispers, like the remnants of conversations long past, echoing off the walls. Then, without warning, I heard a loud crash from the upstairs. My heart raced as I hesitated, torn between curiosity and fear. Against my better judgment, I decided to investigate. I climbed the staircase, each step creaking ominously beneath my weight. The whispers grew louder, swirling around me like a storm. At the top of the stairs, I found a door slightly ajar, and the noise seemed to be coming from within. I pushed it open, revealing a dimly lit room filled with old furniture covered in white sheets. In the center stood a dusty mirror, its surface clouded with age. As I moved closer, I caught a glimpse of a figure in the glass, a woman, her face obscured by shadows, her eyes pleading. "Help me," she whispered, her voice barely above a breath. Startled, I stepped back, nearly tripping over a chair. I turned to flee, but the door slammed shut behind me, trapping me inside. Panic surged through me as I pounded on the door, shouting for help, but the only response was the growing intensity of the whispers. "Stay with us," they chanted, the voices twisting into a dissonant harmony. I felt an icy breeze wash over me, and I turned back to the mirror, where the woman's face was now clearer, her features twisted in despair. "Please, you have to listen," I begged, my heart racing. "What happened to you?" She reached out toward me, her hand pressing against the glass. "They took me, and now they want you. You must break the cycle." Before I could respond, the room shifted around me. The walls pulsed and twisted, the furniture morphing into grotesque shapes. I felt the ground tremble beneath my feet, and the whispers intensified, drowning out my thoughts. The woman's image flickered, and I realized she was trying to warn me. "Find the key," she screamed, her voice piercing through the chaos. "It's hidden in the house. Only then can you escape." In a moment of clarity, I scanned the room, searching for anything that might resemble a key. My eyes fell upon an ornate box atop a dusty dresser, its surface intricately carved. I rushed toward it, the room spinning around me. I pried it open, finding nothing but old trinkets and dust. But then, something glimmered in the corner. I reached in and pulled out a rusted key. Just as I did, the room began to dissolve, the mirror cracking, and the woman's face contorted in anguish. "Hurry," she urged, her voice fading. "You must leave now." With the key clutched tightly in my hand, I dashed to the door, the whispers clawing at my mind, urging me to stay. I shoved the key into the lock, but it wouldn't budge. Panic surged. I twisted and turned the key until I felt a satisfying click. The door swung open, and I stumbled into the hallway. I raced down the stairs, the echoes of the manor swirling around me like a tempest. The whispers turned into screams, a cacophony of voices urging me to return. But I pushed through, desperate to escape. I burst through the front door and collapsed onto the lawn, gasping for fresh air. As I lay there, the sun shining down on me, I felt a sense of relief wash over me. But as I looked back at the manor, I saw the woman's face staring out from the window, her eyes filled with sorrow. In that moment, I understood while I had escaped the physical confines of Eldridge Manor, I had taken a piece of it with me. The whispers lingered in my mind, and the woman's plea echoed in my heart. I would write her story, but I feared the cycle was far from broken. As I drove away from Hollow Creek, I glanced into the rearview mirror, half expecting to see her standing there. Instead, I saw only my reflection, but a chill ran down my spine when I realized the whispers had followed me. I could hear them faintly, weaving through the air like a haunting melody. Stay with us," they sang, and I knew deep down that I would never truly be free from the echoes of Hollow Creek. My name is Nora, and I've always had a passion for photography. I loved capturing fleeting moments in time, preserving memories that would otherwise fade away. But it was the summer of 2023 when I stumbled upon something that would forever change my perspective on the art I cherished. I had just returned to my hometown of Silver Pines after several years away, eager to reconnect with the familiar landscapes of my youth. The town was quaint, surrounded by dense forests and rolling hills. But there was one place I had always been drawn to, the old abandoned church on the outskirts of town. It had been closed for decades, its Gothic architecture crumbling under the weight of neglect, but its beauty still captivated me. One overcast afternoon, I decided to explore the church, camera in hand. The moment I stepped inside, I was enveloped in a heavy silence, the air thick with dust and decay. Sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows, casting eerie patterns on the floor. I felt an electric thrill as I began to photograph the remnants of the past. The peeling paint, the broken pews, and the forgotten altar. As I wandered deeper into the church, I noticed a staircase leading to a small loft. Curiosity piqued. I climbed the creaking steps, my heart racing with anticipation. At the top, I found a dusty room filled with old furniture and boxes. In the corner, I spotted an antique camera, its surface tarnished but still intact. I picked it up, feeling a strange energy emanating from it. It was unlike any camera I had ever seen, adorned with intricate engravings. As I examined it, I noticed a small inscription, "To capture the unseen." Intrigued, I decided to try it out, thinking perhaps it would add a unique touch to my photography. I adjusted the settings and pointed the camera at the window, framing the view of the forest beyond. As I pressed the shutter, a strange sensation washed over me, as if the air crackled with electricity. The click of the shutter echoed loudly, and I felt a wave of dizziness wash over me. When I looked at the photograph, my heart dropped. Instead of the tranquil scene I had expected, the image revealed a ghostly figure standing in the forest, a woman dressed in whitey, her face obscured by shadows. I blinked, stunned. Had I captured a spirit? I shook my head, trying to brush off the thought as a trick of the light. I took a few more shots, each time feeling that same strange energy, and each time capturing an unsettling presence lurking in the background. A child, a man with hollow eyes, and an elderly woman with a haunting smile. As the sun began to set, I felt an overwhelming urge to leave the church, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had awakened something. The air had grown heavy, and shadows danced in the corners of my vision. Once home, I developed the photographs in my makeshift darkroom, my excitement mixed with anxiety. Each image was more chilling than the last, the spectral figures watching me from the depths of the frames. I felt a connection to them, an inexplicable bond that left a chill crawling up my spine. Determined to learn more, I researched the church's history. I discovered that it had been built in the late 1800s, a place of worship for the townsfolk. But tragedy struck when a fire broke out during a storm, claiming the lives of several parishioners, including a woman in white who was said to have been pleading for help. The more I learned, the more I felt drawn to the church and its lost souls. I returned the next day, armed with my camera and a growing sense of purpose. I wanted to capture their stories, to give them a voice in a world that had forgotten them. As I wandered through the church once more, I felt the temperature drop and the shadows grew darker. I set up my camera, determined to capture more of the spirit world. This time, however, as I pressed the shutter, a deep sense of foreboding washed over me. The photograph developed differently this time. Instead of just figures in the background, I saw scenes unfolding, images of the tragic fire, the screams of the townspeople, and the anguished faces of those who had perished. It was as if the camera had opened a portal to the past, revealing the moments that had been frozen in time. But with each photograph, I felt a part of me slip away. The sense of connection to the spirits grew stronger, but so did the darkness surrounding them. Their sorrow seeped into my very being, and I could hear their whispers in the wind. Help us. Remember us. The following night, I returned again, now feeling an inexplicable compulsion to capture the church's final moments. As I took my place in the center of the sanctuary, the shadows closed in around me. I raised the camera, heart pounding, and pressed the shutter. The air crackled with energy, and suddenly the church around me began to shift. The walls trembled, and the whispers grew louder, drowning out my thoughts. Join us, join us. I looked through the viewfinder, and what I saw sent me reeling. The church was alive with the spirits of the lost, their faces twisted in anguish. They reached out to me, their hands grasping, pulling me into their sorrow. The camera felt like a chain binding me to them. No, I screamed, dropping the camera as the world around me began to dissolve. The shadows swirled, enveloping me in darkness. I felt their pain, their longing, and their despair. Help us. Just as I thought I would be consumed, the darkness receded, and I found myself standing alone in the church, the camera lying shattered on the floor. The air was still, the whispers faded into silence. I looked around, heart racing, but the spirits were gone. I stumbled out of the church, gasping for breath. The weight of their sorrow lingered in my chest, but I had escaped, at least for now. I realized that I had been given a glimpse into their world, a chance to understand their suffering, but at a cost. As I left, I glanced back at the church, now just an empty shell. I knew I could never return. The photographs I had taken were more than memories. They were a testament to the darkness that lingered within the church's walls. And though I had escaped, I could still feel their presence in the back of my mind, a reminder that some stories are meant to remain untold, and some spirits are best left undisturbed. My name is Sarah Thompson, and I've always had an obsession with antiques. I adored the stories they held, the lives they had touched, and the history they carried. It was a rainy afternoon in late November when I stumbled upon an old antique shop on the outskirts of town. The sign above the door read "Timeless Treasures," and it beckoned me inside like a moth to a flame. The shop was dimly lit, filled with a jumble of forgotten relics, worn furniture, dusty books, and trinkets from ages past. As I roamed the aisles, I felt an electric thrill in the air, as if the objects themselves were whispering their secrets. My eyes landed on a large, ornate mirror, its frame intricately carved with swirling patterns and strange symbols. Something about it drew me in, and I couldn't resist the urge to reach out and touch its cool surface. The shopkeeper, an elderly woman with piercing blue eyes, appeared beside me. "Ah, the mirror," she said, her voice low and gravelly. "It has a history. They say it reveals more than just one's reflection." Intrigued, I purchased the mirror, convinced it would make an excellent addition to my collection. I brought it home and hung it in my living room, admiring its beauty. That night, as I settled onto the couch with a cup of tea, I caught a glimpse of movement in the mirror. I turned to look, but nothing was there. A chill ran down my spine, but I shrugged it off as fatigue. Days passed, and I found myself increasingly captivated by the mirror. I began to notice peculiar things. Sometimes when I looked into it, I could see shadows flitting behind me, reflections that didn't match my movements. I felt a growing sense of unease, but the allure of the mirror was undeniable. One evening during a particularly stormy night, I decided to document my experiences. I set up my camera to record as I stood in front of the mirror. "If there's anyone here with me, show me a sign," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. The air grew heavy and the room fell silent. Suddenly the temperature dropped and I saw a dark figure appear in the reflection. My heart raced as I spun around, but again, there was nothing behind me. I could feel a presence, something lurking just beyond my sight. I turned back to the mirror, and that's when I saw her. A woman clad in a flowing white dress, her face obscured by shadows. Her eyes glowed with an otherworldly light, and she reached out as if trying to break through the glass. "Help me," she whispered, her voice echoing in the stillness. I stumbled backward, panic surging through me. "Who are you?" I shouted, my voice trembling. "I'm trapped," she replied, her voice filled with sorrow. "I've been here for so long. You must help me find a way out." Fear gripped me, but I felt an inexplicable connection to her. "How can I help you?" I asked, my heart pounding in my chest. "Release me from this mirror," she pleaded. "Find the key hidden in the frame. It holds the power to set me free." Driven by a mix of curiosity and dread, I approached the mirror, running my fingers along the ornate carvings. My heart raced as I searched for the key. Just as I was about to give up, my fingers brushed against a small, cold object lodged in a crevice. I pulled it out, revealing a tarnished key, its surface etched with the same strange symbols as the mirror. "Now use it," the woman urged, her eyes pleading. "Unlock the mirror." Without thinking, I inserted the key into a small lock hidden at the bottom of the frame. The moment I turned it, the room shook, and the mirror began to ripple like water. The woman's form shimmered, and I felt a powerful force pulling me toward the glass. "No!" I screamed, trying to resist, but it was too late. In an instant, I was pulled into the mirror, engulfed in darkness. I tumbled through endless space until I landed on the other side. I found myself in a dimly lit room, identical to my living room but eerily distorted. The furniture was askew, and shadows danced along the walls. I turned around, and there she was, the woman from the mirror, now standing before me. "Thank you for freeing me," she said, her voice now smooth and melodic. "But you've taken my place." Confusion washed over me. "What do you mean? I thought I was helping you." "You did help me," she replied with a wicked smile. "But now you're trapped here with me. This is my domain, and you will be the next soul to wander the mirror for eternity." Panic surged through me as I realized the truth. The mirror didn't just reflect reality, it ensnared souls, trapping them in its twisted realm. I had unwittingly released her while sealing my own fate. As I looked around, I could see reflections of other lost souls trapped within the glass, their faces twisted in despair. I screamed, pounding on the mirror's surface, but it was in vain. The woman's laughter echoed around me, a haunting melody that filled the air. "You'll learn to love it here," she said, her figure fading into the shadows. "After all, there's always room for one more in the mirror." Days turned into weeks, and I became just another reflection in the glass, my essence entwined with the countless others trapped within. Each time someone approached the mirror, I could feel their gaze upon me, and I would silently plead for help, knowing that I would never escape. The curse of the mirror had claimed me, and I would forever remain a prisoner of my own obsession. I'm an archivist at the local historical society in the small town of Pendleton. The year was 2022, and I'd recently inherited my grandmother's old Victorian house on the outskirts of town. It was a place steeped in history, with creaking floorboards and walls that seemed to breathe. I thought it would be the perfect project to document and restore, but I had no idea what I was getting into. Moving in during a stormy October, I felt a sense of excitement mixed with unease. As I unpacked boxes in the dim light of the fading day, the wind howled outside, rattling the windows. I brushed it off as typical autumn weather until I noticed something unusual, faint whispers echoing through the halls. I thought I was just tired, my imagination running wild, so I dismissed it and continued to work. The first night was restless. I lay in bed listening to the house settle, but there was something more. Soft murmurs that seemed to call my name. "Evelyn." They slithered through the darkness, chilling my spine. I sat up, heart racing, and tried to convince myself it was nothing. I reached for my phone and turned on the flashlight, illuminating the corners of my room. Shadows danced, and I felt the air thicken with an unshakable tension. The next day, I decided to explore the attic, hoping to find some old family treasures. Climbing the narrow staircase, I felt a chill that made the hairs on my neck stand on end. The attic was cluttered with dust-covered boxes and forgotten memories. As I rummaged through the piles, I stumbled upon an ornate mirror, its surface cracked but still captivating. I wiped away the dust, and as I gazed into it, I felt a strange pull, as if someone was watching me from the other side. That night, the whispers returned, louder and more insistent. I tried to ignore them, but sleep eluded me. I decided to film the experience for my YouTube channel, hoping to share the eerie happenings in my new home. I set up my camera in the living room, the light casting long shadows that flickered like ghostly fingers. "If there's anyone here with me, let your presence be known," I said, my voice steady despite the fear gnawing at my insides. Suddenly, the temperature dropped, and the whispers turned into frantic murmurs. I could almost make out words, but they were distorted, as if coming from a great distance. I felt a rush of adrenaline as I captured the chaos on camera. The lights flickered, and the mirror in the attic began to vibrate. In a moment of courage, or perhaps foolishness, I decided to confront it. I climbed back up to the attic, my heart pounding. The whispers grew louder, echoing off the walls. "Evelyn, Come closer. I approached the mirror, my reflection warping in the glass. The moment I touched its surface, a blinding light engulfed me. When the light faded, I found myself in a different time, 1892 to be exact. I stood in the attic, but it was vibrant and alive, filled with laughter and warmth. I was no longer just an observer. I was part of the scene. People moved around me, yet no one acknowledged my presence. I felt a deep sense of dread as I realized I was trapped in a moment that wasn't mine. Suddenly, a woman appeared before me, her face pale and expression haunted. "You must leave this place," she warned, her voice urgent. "The mirror is a gateway, but it demands a price. It has taken my soul and now it seeks yours." Panic surged through me as I understood the gravity of my situation. I turned to flee, but the walls began to close in, whispering my name. "Evelyn, stay with us." I sprinted toward the stairs, heart racing, but the whispers grew louder, more desperate. I could feel the mirror's pull dragging me back, just as I thought I'd be lost forever. I plunged through the attic door and crashed back into my own time. Gasping for breath, I found myself back in my living room, surrounded by darkness. The camera recorded my frantic breath and wide eyes. I was back, but something was different. The whispers had ceased, but the mirror lay shattered on the floor, its pieces glistening ominously. I thought I was free, but as I looked around, I felt a presence beside me. The woman from the attic stood there, her face a mask of sorrow. "You escaped, but you're never truly alone," she whispered, fading into the shadows. I had survived, but now I understood the truth. The house was alive, and it had chosen me. Each night the whispers would return, and I would be forced to listen to their stories, forever intertwined with the past. As I looked into the broken mirror, I realized the twist of fate. I was now part of the house's history, destined to guard its secrets for eternity. With a heavy heart, I turned off the camera. Perhaps one day I'd share my story, but for now, I would remain silent, haunted by the echoes of the whispering walls. As a seasoned paranormal investigator, I had seen my fair share of haunted places, but nothing could prepare me for the chilling experience I had at Maplewood Manor. Nestled deep in the woods of New England, the manor was notorious for its dark history, filled with tales of tragedy and loss. It had been abandoned for decades, and now it was my mission to uncover its secrets. It was a crisp autumn evening in October 2022 when I arrived at the manor, armed with my camera, EMF detector, and a sense of determination. The sun dipped low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the overgrown grounds. The imposing structure loomed before me, its windows dark and foreboding, like unblinking eyes watching my every move. Welcome back, everyone. Tonight we're exploring Maplewood Manor, a place rumored to be haunted by the spirits of its former residents, I announced to my viewers, who were eagerly waiting in the chat. Let's see what we can find. As I stepped inside, the air felt thick with history. Dust motes danced in the fading light, and the floor creaked beneath my feet. I switched on my flashlight, illuminating the grand foyer adorned with peeling wallpaper and shattered chandeliers. The atmosphere was heavy, and an unsettling chill ran down my spine. I began my investigation, moving through the manor room by room. The whispers of the past echoed in my ears, a faint melody of sorrow and longing. I felt the presence of someone, watching me. I set up my camera to capture any potential evidence, hoping to connect with the spirits that lingered here. "Is anyone here with me?" I asked, my voice steady but laced with curiosity. The EMF detector flickered to life, a small beep echoing in the silence. The chat exploded with excitement. "You're not alone," one viewer typed, sending a shiver down my spine. I continued to explore, moving into the parlor filled with dust-covered furniture. As I scanned the room, I caught a glimpse of something in the corner, a shadow that flitted just out of view. My heart raced as I approached, but as I turned the corner, I found nothing but an old piano, its keys yellowed and silent. "Let's see if we can communicate with any spirits," I said, pulling out my spirit box. I switched it on and the static crackled to life. "If there's anyone here, please speak to us." At first there was only silence, but then a voice broke through, faint but clear. "Help. Me." I froze, the hair on the back of my neck standing on end. "Who needs help?" I asked, my pulse quickening. The response was a series of garbled words, but one phrase stood out. "Find the truth." The whispers intensified, swirling around me like a tempest. I felt a sudden rush of cold air, and I turned to see a figure standing at the edge of the room. A woman in a tattered white dress, her face obscured by shadows. My breath hitched in my throat. "Who are you?" I managed to ask. "Help me, please," she pleaded, her voice trembling. "I'm trapped here." "Trapped? How?" I asked, my heart pounding. She pointed toward the staircase, and I felt an overwhelming urge to follow her. "You must find the truth," she whispered, before vanishing into thin air. I hesitated for a moment, but the call to uncover the manor's secrets was too strong. I climbed the creaking stairs, each step echoing through the empty halls. The air grew heavier, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. I reached the second floor, where the whispers grew louder, urging me on. At the end of the hallway, I found a door slightly ajar. Pushing it open, I entered a dimly lit room filled with dust-covered furniture and old photographs. As I scanned the walls, I felt a strange pull toward one particular picture, a family portrait of a woman who looked strikingly similar to the spirit I had seen. Suddenly, the whispers crescendoed, and I heard the woman's voice again, clear and desperate. "Find the diary. It holds the truth." I searched the room frantically, and finally, beneath a loose floorboard, I discovered an old leather-bound diary. I opened it, the pages yellowed and brittle, revealing the heart-wrenching story of the woman in the portrait. Her name was Lillian, and she had suffered great loss after a fire consumed her family within these very walls. As I read, the room grew colder, and the whispers transformed into cries of anguish. "Help us," they echoed, filling my mind. I realized that Lillian's spirit was not alone. She was bound to the manor along with her family, trapped in a cycle of grief. "Lillian," I called out, clutching the diary, "I know your story now. You're not alone." The air shifted, and for a moment, I felt a warmth envelop me, as if the spirits were surrounding me in gratitude. Just then, the door slammed shut, and darkness enveloped the room. I felt a surge of panic as the cries grew louder, drowning out my thoughts. "Lillian, what do I do?" I shouted, desperation clawing at my throat. "Set us free," the voices screamed, and in that moment I understood. I had to acknowledge their pain, to honor their memory. I raised the diary, my voice steady. "I will tell your story, Lillian. I will make sure you are remembered." As I spoke those words, I felt the temperature rise, and the darkness began to lift. The whispers transformed into soft sighs of relief, and the pressure in the room released. The door creaked open, and I stepped back into the hallway, feeling lighter than I had moments before. "Thank you," a soft voice echoed, and I looked back to see Lillian standing there, her expression no longer one of sorrow but of peace. "You've set us free." With that, she faded into the light, and I felt the weight of the manor's grief lift. I exited the house, my heart swelling with a sense of purpose. I had uncovered the truth of Maplewood Manor, and in doing so I had given a voice to the whispers that had haunted its halls for so long. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that the manor would always be a part of me. I had stepped into a world of shadows and echoes, but I had emerged as a beacon of light, determined to share Lillian's story and honor those lost within the walls of Maplewood Manor.